Is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene authentic scripture or ancient heresy? Was Mary Magdalene really Jesus' closest disciple, or is that just modern fiction? And why did this text disappear for over 1,500 years? Today, we're diving deep into the complete story of this mysterious gospel, from its shocking discovery to its controversial contents and what it reveals about the hidden history of early Christianity that church leaders never wanted you to know. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Your support means we can continue producing these videos to help you learn more or unwind. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a community here so you can connect with like-minded people from around the world in the comment section down below. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? A dusty manuscript lies forgotten in a Cairo antiquities shop. The year is 1896. European scholars hunt for ancient treasures along the Nile. They seek papyrus scrolls, ceramic fragments, anything that might unlock the secrets of early Christianity. Dr. Karl Reinhardt, a German collector, examines a leather-bound codex. The pages crackle with age. Faded ink reveals Greek text written in careful script. He cannot know that this simple purchase will shake the foundations of Christian history. Within these fragile pages lies a gospel bearing the name of Mary Magdalene, the same woman who stood at the cross, the same woman who discovered the empty tomb, the same woman whose voice was silenced for nearly 2,000 years. The ancient world kept many secrets. Sacred texts were buried in desert caves. Forbidden gospels were hidden from church authorities. Early Christians destroyed books that challenged their growing power. They burned manuscripts that contained uncomfortable truths. They erased women from positions of spiritual authority. They rewrote history to fit their vision of faith. Mary Magdalene becomes a ghost in this process. Her story transforms from teacher to penitent, from apostle to prostitute, from prophet to sinner. The official church narrative reduces her to tears and shame. Yet, somewhere in the Egyptian desert, her true voice waits patiently in the darkness. This is not simply a story about an ancient text. Beyond the scholarly debates and theological arguments lies something more profound. At first glance, it may seem like another archaeological discovery. It carries the weight of every silenced voice throughout history. It stands as proof that truth has a way of surviving, even when buried beneath centuries of dust and denial. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene challenges everything we thought we knew about early Christianity. More than a historical curiosity, it represents a battle for the soul of a religion. The manuscript reveals power struggles between male apostles and female disciples. It exposes the tension between institutional authority and personal revelation. It shows us a Christianity that might have been before the church closed its doors to women's wisdom. In 1896, when Dr. Reinhardt purchased that codex, he unknowingly began a revolution. The text would travel from Cairo to Berlin. Scholars would debate its authenticity. Theologians would question its implications. Feminists would reclaim its message. Popular culture would embrace its mysteries. Dan Brown would write bestsellers about its secrets. But the revolution began much earlier. It started with a woman named Mary, standing in a garden, speaking words that would echo through eternity. Words that threatened the emerging church so deeply that they tried to erase her completely. Words that survived in fragments, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The mystery deepens when we consider what we lost. The Gospel of Mary is incomplete. Pages are missing from the beginning and middle. Entire conversations vanish into silence. We glimpse only fragments of her teaching, like hearing whispers through a closed door. What secrets died with those lost pages? What wisdom was deliberately destroyed? This documentary follows the trail of evidence across 2 millennia. We begin with Mary herself, a first-century Jewish woman who walked beside Jesus. We track her story through the early Christian communities where she served as teacher and visionary. We witness her gradual erasure from official church history. We celebrate her rediscovery in the modern world. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene is more than ancient parchment and faded ink. It represents every woman whose voice was silenced, every teacher whose wisdom was dismissed, every prophet whose vision was denied. The text asks us to imagine a different Christianity, one where women shared equal authority with men, where inner knowledge mattered more than external ritual, where the divine spoke through many voices, not just one. As we embark on this journey, we must prepare for surprises. The Mary Magdalene of popular imagination bears little resemblance to the Mary of historical record. The early church was far more diverse than modern Christianity suggests. The process of creating orthodox doctrine was messy, political, and often violent. Truth and power rarely walked hand in hand. The story begins with a question that echoes through history. What did Mary Magdalene know, and why was her gospel buried for centuries? The answer will take us from the dusty streets of first-century Palestine to the scholarly libraries of modern universities, from the caves of Egypt to the bestseller lists of contemporary culture, from the silence of suppression to the power of rediscovery, the lost text. The manuscript that would change everything arrived in Berlin like a refugee from another world. Dr. Karl Reinhardt had purchased it from a Cairo antiquities dealer in 1896. The leather binding showed signs of careful preservation. Someone had valued this text enough to protect it through centuries of upheaval. Someone had risked everything to keep these words alive. The Codex contained multiple texts written in Coptic, the ancient Egyptian language that survived the pharaohs and adopted Greek letters. Coptic Christianity had flourished in Egypt for centuries before Arab conquest changed the religious landscape. Monks in remote monasteries copied sacred texts by candlelight. They preserved gospels that Rome had declared heretical. They kept alive traditions that mainstream Christianity had abandoned. Dr. Reinhardt recognized the importance of his purchase. He contacted Carl Schmidt, a German scholar specializing in Coptic manuscripts. Schmidt examined the Codex and gasped at what he found. Among the texts was a gospel attributed to Mary Magdalene. No such text had ever been discovered. Church historians had mentioned it in passing, usually to condemn it as heretical. Most scholars assumed it had been lost forever. The manuscript presented immediate challenges. Pages were missing from the beginning and middle sections. The surviving text started abruptly, without introduction or context. Entire conversations appeared to be incomplete. It was like discovering a play with the first act missing and several scenes torn out. The fragments tantalized scholars with glimpses of something extraordinary, while leaving enormous gaps in understanding. Schmidt began the painstaking process of translation. Each word required careful consideration. Coptic grammar differed from modern languages. Ancient scribes sometimes abbreviated words or used symbols scholars had to decode. The papyrus was fragile. Handling it too roughly might destroy irreplaceable text. Schmidt worked with the intensity of an archaeologist uncovering buried treasure. The surviving text revealed a remarkable scene. Mary Magdalene stands before the grieving apostles after Jesus' departure. They weep in despair, unable to continue their mission. Mary comforts them with words of strength and wisdom. She shares a vision that Jesus had given her privately. The vision describes the soul's journey through hostile cosmic powers toward ultimate liberation. This portrayal of Mary shocked scholars. Here was no repentant sinner or emotional woman. The text presented her as a teacher, visionary, and spiritual authority. She possessed knowledge that the male apostles lacked. She displayed courage while they showed fear. She offered comfort while they wallowed in despair. This Mary bore no resemblance to the figure portrayed in traditional church history. The manuscript's condition told its own story. Someone had carefully preserved it despite obvious danger. Possessing heretical texts could result in persecution or death. The early church had launched systematic campaigns to destroy Gnostic literature. They burned books and punished anyone who possessed them. Yet this text survived, hidden away in Egypt's dry climate. Carbon dating placed the manuscript in the 4th or 5th century. This meant it was a copy of an even earlier text. The original Gospel of Mary might have been written in the 2nd century, within living memory of Jesus' disciples. Early church fathers had mentioned such a text, usually to condemn it. Now, scholars held proof that it had actually existed. The missing pages became a source of endless speculation. What had the beginning contained? Perhaps an introduction explaining how Mary received her revelation. Maybe a description of Jesus' final teachings to his inner circle. The missing middle section might have included more of Mary's vision or additional conversations with the apostles. These gaps in the text felt like missing pieces of a historical puzzle. Schmidt's translation work took years. He cross-referenced obscure Coptic terms with other ancient texts. He consulted with experts in Gnostic literature. He compared the manuscript with fragments of other Gospels. Slowly, a picture emerged of early Christianity far more diverse than anyone had imagined. The text belonged to a tradition called Gnosticism. These Christians believed in secret knowledge that could liberate the soul from material bondage. They valued inner revelation over external authority. They often portrayed Jesus as a teacher of wisdom rather than a sacrificial savior. Many Gnostic texts featured women in prominent roles, contrary to mainstream Christian practice. The Gospel of Mary fit this pattern perfectly. It emphasized inner knowledge over institutional authority. It portrayed revelation as ongoing rather than complete. It placed a woman at the center of spiritual teaching. These elements would have been deeply threatening to church leaders trying to establish uniform doctrine and hierarchical control. As Schmidt worked on his translation, he realized he was handling dynamite. The text challenged fundamental assumptions about early Christianity. It suggested that Jesus had shared secret teachings with select disciples. It implied that Mary Magdalene had possessed special authority among the apostles. It presented a version of Christian faith that valued personal revelation over institutional control. The manuscript's survival seemed almost miraculous. Most Gnostic texts had been destroyed during the 4th and 5th centuries. Church councils had declared them heretical. Bishops had ordered their destruction. Owners had been persecuted. Yet somehow, in the caves and monasteries of Egypt, a few texts had escaped the flames. The Gospel of Mary would remain largely unknown to the general public for decades. Schmidt published his translation in scholarly journals. A few academics debated its significance. But the text would not capture popular imagination until much later. It waited patiently in libraries and archives, like a seed waiting for the right season to bloom. Who was Mary Magdalene? Mary Magdalene walks through the pages of the New Testament like a figure emerging from shadow into light. Her presence is undeniable, yet mysterious. She appears at crucial moments in Jesus' story, then fades from view. The Gospel writers mention her name more than most of the male apostles, yet they tell us almost nothing about her background or personality. The name itself offers clues. Mary was a common name in first-century Palestine. Magdalene likely refers to her hometown of Magdala, a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee. This small detail places her in Jesus' geographical orbit. Magdala was known for its fish processing industry. The town exported salted fish throughout the Roman Empire. Mary would have grown up in a commercial community connected to the wider world. Luke's gospel provides the most specific information about Mary's background. He tells us that Jesus cast 7 demons out of her. And this description has shaped centuries of interpretation. Church fathers used it to paint Mary as a deeply sinful woman. They imagined her as a prostitute or adulteress. They created elaborate stories about her shameful past and dramatic conversion. Modern scholars question these interpretations. Demon possession in the ancient world often described mental illness or physical ailments. People with epilepsy, depression, or chronic pain might be said to have demons. The number 7 suggested completeness rather than specific sins. Luke's description might simply mean that Jesus healed Mary of serious illness. The Gospel writers consistently place Mary in Jesus' inner circle. Luke mentions her as one of the women who traveled Jesus and supported his ministry financially. This detail suggests she had independent means. Not many women in the ancient world could afford to leave their homes and follow a wandering teacher. Mary's financial support helped sustain Jesus' mission. Matthew, Mark, and John all place Mary at the crucifixion. While the male disciples fled in fear, Mary remained. She watched Jesus die. She saw where his body was placed. She maintained her loyalty when others abandoned him. This courage marked her as someone special in the early Christian community. The resurrection narratives give Mary extraordinary prominence. All 4 Gospels mention her discovery of the empty tomb. John's Gospel presents her as the first witness to the risen Jesus. He appears to her alone in the garden. He speaks her name, and she recognizes him. He gives her a message to carry to the other disciples. She becomes the first evangelist, the first person to proclaim the good news of resurrection. This role as primary witness to resurrection would have carried enormous significance in the early church. Paul's letters emphasize the importance of resurrection witnesses. He lists the people who saw the risen Jesus, using their testimony to validate the Christian message. Mary's position as first witness should have given her tremendous authority in the growing movement. Yet something strange happens in the biblical record. After the resurrection accounts, Mary Magdalene virtually disappears. The book of Acts chronicles the early church's development, but rarely mentions women by name. Paul's letters reference various female leaders, but never specifically name Mary Magdalene. The woman who stood at the cross and discovered the empty tomb seems to vanish from Christian history. This silence becomes more puzzling when we consider Mary's prominence in the Gospels. She appears by name 12 times in the New Testament. This frequency exceeds most of the male apostles. Only Peter, John, and Judas are mentioned more often. Yet while we know details about these men's personalities and activities, Mary remains an enigma. The Gospel writers seem to assume their readers already know about Mary. They mention her without explanation, as if her importance was obvious. This suggests she was a well-known figure in the early Christian communities. Her reputation was so established that the evangelists felt no need to introduce her properly. Later Christian tradition fills the silence with speculation. Some texts identify her with Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Others connect her with the unnamed woman who anointed Jesus' feet. These identifications seem driven more by the desire to create a complete picture than by historical evidence. The Eastern Orthodox Church has always distinguished Mary Magdalene from these other women. They venerate her as a separate figure, equal to the apostles. They call her the apostle to the apostles because she brought the resurrection message to the other disciples. This tradition preserves a more positive view of Mary's role. Western Christianity took a different path. Pope Gregory the Great, in the 6th century, officially identified Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and the unnamed sinful woman. This conflation created the image of Mary as a repentant prostitute. The Church used her story to illustrate the power of redemption and the importance of penance. This transformation of Mary's image had profound consequences. The woman who had been Jesus' close companion became a symbol of female sinfulness. The witness to resurrection became a model of penitence. The teacher and evangelist became a reformed prostitute. The Church's Mary Magdalene bore little resemblance to the Mary of the Gospels. Archaeological evidence from Magdala adds another layer to Mary's story. Recent excavations have uncovered a 1st century synagogue in her hometown. The building's elaborate decorations suggest a prosperous community. Stone vessels indicate careful attention to ritual purity. These findings paint a picture of a devout Jewish community where Mary would have learned scripture and tradition. The historical Mary Magdalene emerges as a fascinating figure. She was a woman of means who chose to follow Jesus. She remained loyal when others fled. She witnessed the most important moments in Christian history. She carried the first resurrection message. Yet her story was gradually obscured by centuries of misinterpretation and deliberate suppression. The Gospel of Mary offers a different perspective on this remarkable woman. It presents her as a teacher and visionary, not a penitent sinner. It shows her comforting the disciples and sharing divine revelation. It portrays her as a spiritual authority in her own right. This Mary might be closer to the historical figure than the traditional church version. Mary and the early church. The early Christian movement was far more diverse than most people imagine. Small communities scattered across the Roman Empire interpreted Jesus' message in various ways. Some emphasized his Jewish roots, others focused on his universal appeal. Some expected his immediate return, others settled in for a long wait. Into this varied landscape, Mary Magdalene stepped as a significant figure. The book of Acts describes the early church as a unified movement led by the 12 apostles. Peter emerges as the primary leader, giving speeches and making decisions. Paul travels extensively, establishing churches and writing letters. The narrative presents a clear line of authority from Jesus through the apostles to the growing church. Women appear mainly as supporters and converts, not as leaders or teachers. This picture becomes more complicated when we examine other early Christian texts. The Gospel of John hints at Mary's special relationship with Jesus. He appears to her first after resurrection. He gives her a message for the other disciples. She becomes the first person to proclaim the good news. This role suggests she held significant authority in the original Christian community. Paul's letters reveal a more complex picture of women's roles. He mentions female leaders like Phoebe, Priscilla, and Junia. He calls Junia an apostle, using the same term applied to Peter and himself. He describes women as co-workers in the gospel ministry. These references suggest that women played more prominent roles than later church tradition acknowledged. The tension between male and female leadership becomes explicit in some New Testament passages. Paul's letters contain contradictory instructions about women's roles. In some places, he encourages women to prophesy and pray in public. In others, he tells them to remain silent. These contradictions might reflect different situations or later editorial additions. The Gospel of Mary illuminates this tension dramatically. When Mary shares her vision with the apostles, Peter questions her authority. He asks whether Jesus would really have spoken privately to a woman. He suggests that Mary might be lying or mistaken. This confrontation reveals the power struggles that shaped early Christianity. Andrew joins Peter in questioning Mary's revelation. He wonders whether Jesus actually gave her secret teachings. The two leading apostles present a united front against Mary's authority. They represent the emerging institutional church that wanted to control Christian teaching and practice. Levi defends Mary against these attacks. He reminds Peter of his own weaknesses and suggests that Jesus chose Mary for special revelation. This support indicates that Mary had allies among the apostles. The early church was not unanimous in its attitude toward women's leadership. The conflict between Peter and Mary represents more than personal disagreement. It symbolizes the struggle between different visions of Christianity. Peter represents institutional authority based on official appointment. Mary represents charismatic authority based on personal revelation. These competing sources of power would shape Christian history for centuries. The institutional church gradually marginalized charismatic authority. Bishops replaced prophets as primary leaders. Written creeds replaced personal visions as sources of truth. Male ordination replaced female ministry as the norm. The church became more organized but less diverse. It gained stability but lost some of its original vitality. Mary's disappearance from official church history reflects this broader transformation. As the church became more hierarchical, women's roles became more restricted. As doctrine became more standardized, diverse interpretations were discouraged. As authority became more centralized, local traditions were suppressed. The process was gradual but steady. Second-century church fathers like Irenaeus began defining orthodox doctrine. They identified approved texts and rejected others. They established clearer lines of authority. They created mechanisms for maintaining uniformity. These developments strengthened the church but also narrowed its vision. Women's exclusion from leadership was not immediate or complete. Archaeological evidence shows women serving as deacons, priests, and bishops in some communities. Inscriptions identify women as church leaders. Art depicts women performing liturgical functions. The official restriction of women's roles took centuries to implement fully. Mary Magdalene became a casualty of this process. Her role as apostle to the apostles was gradually forgotten. Her position as primary resurrection witness was downplayed. Her authority as teacher and visionary was denied. The church preferred a Mary who represented penitence rather than power. The transformation was not accidental. The early church faced enormous challenges. It needed to establish its legitimacy in a hostile environment. It had to compete with other religious movements. It required clear leadership and unified doctrine. Marginalizing women's authority seemed necessary for organizational survival. The cost of this transformation was enormous. The church lost the perspectives and gifts of half its members. It abandoned the inclusive vision that had marked Jesus' own ministry. It created a hierarchy that contradicted the gospel message of equality. It chose institutional power over spiritual authenticity. The Gospel of Mary preserves a memory of what might have been. It shows us a Christianity where women shared equal authority with men, where personal revelation mattered as much as institutional approval, where diverse voices contributed to the community's understanding. This vision challenges us to imagine different possibilities for Christian faith. The early church's treatment of Mary Magdalene parallels its treatment of other marginalized groups. Jewish Christians were gradually excluded from the mainstream movement. Gnostic communities were declared heretical. Local traditions were suppressed in favor of Roman uniformity. The church became more powerful, but less inclusive. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the significance of the Gospel of Mary. It represents not just Mary's individual voice, but the voices of all who were silenced. It challenges us to reconsider the path Christianity took. It invites us to imagine what the church might look like if it had embraced rather than rejected its diverse heritage. The world of Gnosticism. Beyond the familiar Christianity of Sunday schools and traditional churches existed another world. This was the realm of Gnosticism, a movement that flourished in the first centuries after Jesus. Gnostics believed that secret knowledge could liberate the soul from material bondage. They developed complex mythologies to explain human suffering. They created elaborate rituals to achieve spirit transformation. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek term gnosis, meaning knowledge. This was not ordinary knowledge gained through study or experience. Gnostic knowledge was mystical, intuitive, and transformative. It revealed the true nature of reality and showed the path to spiritual freedom. Only those with special insight could receive this knowledge. Only those who received it could achieve salvation. Gnostic cosmology painted a picture of reality far different from mainstream Christianity. The material world was not God's good creation, but a prison built by evil forces. The true God dwelt in a distant realm of pure spirit. Between the divine realm and the material world existed various levels of spiritual beings. Some of these beings helped souls return to God. Others tried to keep them trapped in matter. The human soul was a spark of divine light trapped in material flesh. Most people lived in ignorance of their true nature. They mistook the material world for ultimate reality. They worshipped false gods who claimed to be supreme. They remained enslaved to physical desires and social conventions. Only through gnosis could they discover their divine origins and find the way home. Jesus played a crucial role in Gnostic thought, but not as traditional Christians understood him. Gnostics saw him as a revealer of secret knowledge rather than a sacrificial savior. He came to awaken humanity to its true nature. He taught those who were ready to receive higher wisdom. He showed the way to escape material bondage and return to the divine realm. Different Gnostic groups developed different interpretations of Jesus' role. Some believed he was a divine being who only appeared to have a human body. Others thought he was a human who became divine through special knowledge. Still others saw him as one of many teachers who revealed the same essential truth. These variations reflected Gnosticism's diversity rather than its unity. The Gnostic view of salvation differed dramatically from Orthodox Christianity. Mainstream Christians emphasized faith in Christ's sacrificial death. They believed Jesus' blood paid the price for human sin. They taught that salvation came through grace, not works. They stressed the importance of baptism and church membership. Gnostics took a different approach. They believed salvation came through knowledge of one's true nature. They taught that the divine spark within each person was already perfect. They emphasized self-discovery rather than external redemption. They valued personal revelation over institutional authority. They sought liberation from the material world rather than its transformation. This emphasis on inner knowledge made Gnosticism appealing to many people. It promised direct access to the divine without priestly mediation. It offered explanations for human suffering that didn't blame God. It provided hope for those who felt trapped by social circumstances. It validated personal spiritual experiences that Orthodox Christianity often dismissed. Gnostic communities developed rich traditions of teaching and practice. They created elaborate initiation rituals that guided seekers through stages of enlightenment. They wrote Gospels that recorded Jesus' secret teachings. They composed hymns that celebrated the soul's journey to God. They developed meditation practices that fostered inner vision. Women played prominent roles in many Gnostic communities. Gnostic texts often featured female figures as teachers and revealers. The divine realm included feminine aspects that balanced masculine elements. Some Gnostic groups had female leaders and prophets. This openness to women's spiritual authority set Gnosticism apart from mainstream Christianity. The Gospel of Mary fits perfectly into this Gnostic worldview. Mary receives secret revelation from Jesus. She teaches the other apostles about the soul's journey. She faces opposition from those who reject her authority. She represents the Gnostic ideal of the enlightened teacher who shares transformative knowledge. The text's emphasis on inner vision aligns with Gnostic practice. Mary's revelation comes through mystical experience rather than external authority. She describes the soul's encounter with hostile powers that try to prevent its ascent. She offers comfort to those who despair about their spiritual condition. These elements would have resonated strongly with Gnostic readers. Orthodox Christianity viewed Gnosticism as a dangerous threat. Church fathers like Irenaeus wrote lengthy treatises against Gnostic teachings. They accused Gnostics of corrupting Christian faith with foreign philosophies. They criticized Gnostic emphasis on secret knowledge as elitist and divisive. They condemned Gnostic texts as heretical fabrications. The conflict between Orthodox and Gnostic Christianity was not merely theological. It involved questions of authority, community structure, and religious practice. Orthodox Christians emphasized unity under episcopal leadership. Gnostics valued diversity and personal revelation. Orthodox Christians developed standardized rituals and creeds. Gnostics created varied practices suited to different spiritual needs. The Orthodox position gradually prevailed through a combination of factors. The Church developed more effective organizational structures. It gained support from Roman authorities. It created mechanisms for maintaining doctrinal uniformity. It successfully portrayed Gnosticism as foreign to authentic Christianity. By the 4th century, Gnostic communities were in decline. The suppression of Gnosticism was not complete or immediate. Gnostic ideas continued to influence Christian thought. Mystics and contemplatives preserved many Gnostic insights. Popular movements sometimes revived Gnostic themes. The questions Gnosticism raised about the nature of God, the problem of evil, and the path to salvation remained relevant. The rediscovery of Gnostic texts in the modern era has sparked new interest in these ancient movements. Scholars have gained a better understanding of Gnostic diversity and sophistication. Some Christians have found in Gnosticism resources for contemporary spiritual practice. Others have used Gnostic insights to critique institutional Christianity. The Gospel of Mary serves as a bridge between these worlds. It preserves Gnostic wisdom while maintaining connections to canonical Christianity. It shows how early Christians grappled with questions that remain relevant today. It demonstrates the diversity that characterized early Christianity before orthodoxy narrowed the acceptable range of belief. The Gnostic Gospels. The sands of Egypt have yielded treasures beyond gold and precious stones. Hidden in caves and buried in ancient garbage dumps, manuscripts have survived that tell a different story about early Christianity. These are the Gnostic Gospels, texts that the Orthodox Church tried to destroy, but that time and climate preserved for future generations. The Gospel of Thomas stands as perhaps the most famous of these discoveries. This collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus presents him as a wisdom teacher rather than a divine savior. The text begins with a striking claim. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. The very first line announces that Jesus shared hidden teachings with select disciples. Many of Thomas's sayings parallel those found in the canonical Gospels. Jesus speaks in parables and metaphors. He challenges conventional wisdom. He offers cryptic teachings that require interpretation. However, the overall message differs significantly from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Thomas's Jesus emphasizes self-knowledge and inner transformation rather than external salvation. The Gospel of Philip presents an even more radical vision. This text portrays Jesus as having a special relationship with Mary Magdalene. It describes her as his companion and suggests that Jesus loved her more than the other disciples. The text states that Jesus often kissed Mary, which made the other disciples jealous. These intimate details would have shocked Orthodox Christians. Philip's Gospel also contains elaborate discussions of sacramental mysteries. It describes rituals of baptism, chrismation, and sacred marriage. The text suggests that these ceremonies reveal hidden truths about the nature of reality. Only those who understand the mysteries can achieve true salvation. Knowledge becomes more important than faith. The Gospel of Truth, attributed to the Gnostic teacher Valentinus, reads more like a theological meditation than a narrative gospel. It explores themes of ignorance and enlightenment, error and truth, forgetfulness and remembrance. The text describes how the Divine Father reveals himself through Jesus to those who are ready to receive knowledge. This gospel portrays Jesus as a teacher who removes ignorance and reveals truth. His death serves not as atonement for sin, but as a demonstration of divine love. His resurrection shows that truth cannot be destroyed by material forces. The text emphasizes the transformation that comes through understanding rather than belief. The Apocryphon of John presents one of the most complex Gnostic mythologies. This text describes how the material world came into being through the actions of a false god called the Demiurge. The true God remains hidden in the highest realm of spirit. Jesus appears as a revealer who teaches select disciples about the true nature of reality. This gospel features a lengthy dialogue between Jesus and John the Apostle. Jesus explains the structure of the spiritual realm and the tragedy of material creation. He describes how divine sparks became trapped in human bodies. He reveals the path of return to the divine realm. The text presents salvation as awakening from ignorance rather than redemption from sin. The Gospel of Mary fits naturally into this collection of alternative Christian texts. Like the other Gnostic Gospels, it emphasizes secret knowledge and inner revelation. It presents Jesus as a teacher who shares hidden wisdom with select disciples. It features a dialogue format that reveals profound truths to those who can understand them. Mary's Gospel shares with Thomas an emphasis on the disciples' confusion and need for guidance. Both texts show Jesus' followers struggling to understand his teachings. Both present special disciples who receive private instruction. Both emphasize the importance of spiritual insight over literal interpretation. The intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary in her Gospel parallels the special connection described in the Gospel of Philip. Both texts suggest that Jesus had closer relationships with some disciples than others. Both present Mary as having special knowledge that the other apostles lack. Both challenge traditional assumptions about authority and gender roles. The visionary content of Mary's Gospel connects it to texts like the Apocryphon of John. Both describe the soul's journey through hostile spiritual powers. Both present elaborate cosmologies that explain human suffering. Both offer hope for liberation from material bondage through proper knowledge. These Gnostic Gospels emerged from communities that valued diversity and personal revelation. Unlike the Orthodox Church, which developed standardized creeds and hierarchical structures, Gnostic groups encouraged varied interpretations of Christian faith. They produced multiple Gospels because they believed truth could be expressed in many ways. The texts also reflect the social circumstances of their communities. Many Gnostic groups included educated urban dwellers who were attracted to philosophical speculation. They had the leisure time and intellectual resources to develop complex theological systems. They valued learning and contemplation over simple faith and obedience. The role of women in Gnostic Gospels reflects the greater gender equality in these communities. Texts like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and the Dialogue of the Savior feature women as teachers and visionaries. They present female figures as recipients of divine revelation. They challenge patriarchal assumptions about spiritual authority. The Orthodox Church's response to these texts was swift and severe. Church fathers like Irenaeus wrote detailed refutations of Gnostic teachings. They accused Gnostic authors of corrupting Christian faith with foreign philosophies. They declared Gnostic texts heretical and forbade their use in Christian communities. The campaign against Gnostic literature was remarkably successful. Most Gnostic texts were destroyed during the 4th and 5th centuries. Libraries were purged of heretical books. Individuals who possessed forbidden texts faced persecution. The rich diversity of early Christian literature was reduced to a small collection of approved writings. The survival of the Gnostic Gospels seems almost miraculous. The dry climate of Egypt preserved papyrus that would have decayed in other environments. Remote monasteries protected some texts from imperial destruction. Hidden caches preserved entire libraries of forbidden books. These factors combined to save invaluable witnesses to early Christian diversity. The modern rediscovery of these texts has revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity. Scholars have gained new insights into the development of Christian doctrine. They have discovered the rich variety of early Christian thought. They have uncovered the complex process by which orthodoxy emerged from diversity. The Gnostic Gospels remind us that the Christianity we know today is the result of historical choices and power struggles. Other versions of Christian faith were possible. Other interpretations of Jesus' message were developed. Other communities of believers created their own traditions and practices. The Orthodox victory was not inevitable or necessarily desirable. The Gospel of Mary takes its place among these alternative voices as a witness to what might have been. It preserves the memory of a Christianity that valued women's spiritual authority. It offers a vision of faith based on inner knowledge rather than external authority. It challenges us to imagine different possibilities for Christian community and practice. The Gospel of Mary. Overview. The surviving fragments of the Gospel of Mary thrust us into a moment of profound crisis. The apostles sit in darkness, overwhelmed by grief and fear. Jesus has departed, leaving them uncertain about their future. They weep like children abandoned by their father. They lack the courage to continue the mission he entrusted to them. The familiar world has collapsed, and they cannot imagine how to rebuild it. Into this despair steps Mary Magdalene. She rises from among the grieving disciples like light piercing darkness. Where others see only loss, she perceives opportunity. Where others feel abandonment, she senses presence. Her voice carries authority that comes from deep spiritual experience. She speaks to the apostles as a teacher addresses confused students. Mary's first words offer comfort and reassurance. She reminds the apostles that Jesus' presence continues among them. His departure was not abandonment, but transformation. His essence remains available to those who seek it. She encourages them to put aside their grief and fear. She challenges them to embrace their calling with renewed confidence. The text presents Mary as someone who has moved beyond the emotional turmoil that paralyzes the other disciples. She has achieved a spiritual maturity that enables her to offer guidance. Her wisdom comes not from book learning, but from direct experience of divine revelation. She stands as a bridge between the departed Jesus and the confused apostles. Peter responds to Mary's words with curiosity and perhaps some skepticism. He asks her to share any special teachings that Jesus might have given her privately. This request acknowledges Mary's unique relationship with Jesus while also testing her authority. Peter represents the institutional church's desire to control and validate spiritual revelation. Mary agrees to share her vision, but she does so with some reluctance. She understands that her words might be misunderstood or rejected. She knows that claiming special revelation from Jesus is dangerous, yet she also recognizes her responsibility to share what she has received. Her decision to speak demonstrates courage and spiritual maturity. The vision Mary describes takes the form of a dialogue between her and Jesus. This conversation occurs in a mystical state that transcends ordinary consciousness. Jesus appears to Mary not as a physical presence, but as a spiritual teacher who reveals hidden truths. The dialogue format allows for detailed instruction about complex spiritual matters. Jesus begins by explaining the nature of vision itself. He describes how the soul perceives spiritual reality through an inner faculty that transcends the physical senses. This mystical sight enables the soul to see beyond the material world into the realm of spirit. The teaching emphasizes that spiritual truth cannot be grasped through ordinary perception. The central focus of Mary's vision is the soul's journey through hostile spiritual powers. Jesus describes how the soul must ascend through various levels of spiritual opposition. Each level presents different challenges that test the soul's understanding and resolve. The powers interrogate the ascending soul, demanding explanations and trying to block its progress. The soul responds to each challenge with knowledge rather than force. It explains its true nature and origin. It demonstrates understanding of spiritual principles. It refuses to be intimidated by the power's threats. This dialogue between soul and powers serves as a teaching tool about the nature of spiritual liberation. The vision portrays salvation as an active process rather than a passive gift. The soul must participate in its own liberation. It must gain knowledge about its true nature and destiny. It must develop the courage to face spiritual opposition. It must learn to navigate the complex spiritual realm that lies between earth and heaven. Mary's account of this vision reveals her role as a spiritual teacher. She has received complex instruction about the nature of reality and the path to salvation. She understands the symbolic language in which spiritual truths are expressed. She can interpret mystical experiences for those who lack such insight. Her teaching demonstrates mastery of Gnostic wisdom. The Gospel presents Mary's revelation as authentic and authoritative. The text does not question whether she actually received this vision from Jesus. It does not suggest that her experience was mistaken or fabricated. Instead, it treats her mystical encounter as a legitimate source of spiritual instruction. This validation of women's visionary experience would have been radical in the ancient world. The response of the other apostles to Mary's teaching reveals the gender dynamics that shaped early Christianity. Some disciples accept her authority and benefit from her instruction. Others question whether Jesus would have shared such important teachings with a woman. This division reflects broader debates about women's roles in Christian communities. The Gospel's fragmentary state adds to its mysterious power. The missing beginning leaves us wondering how the text originally introduced Mary and established the context for her teaching. The gaps in the middle create suspense about what other revelations might have been included. The abrupt ending suggests that more instruction was available to those who sought it. Despite its incomplete condition, the surviving text paints a clear picture of Mary as a spiritual authority. She possesses knowledge that others lack. She demonstrates courage in the face of opposition. She offers comfort to those who despair. She bridges the gap between the departed Jesus and the confused apostles. Her teaching provides guidance for the soul's journey to God. The Gospel of Mary challenges readers to reconsider their assumptions about spiritual authority. It suggests that divine revelation can come through unexpected channels. It demonstrates that women can serve as effective spiritual teachers. It shows that mystical experience provides valid knowledge about ultimate reality. These themes would have been controversial in the ancient world and remain challenging today. The text also raises questions about the nature of Christian community. Should the church value diverse sources of revelation or maintain unified doctrine? Should it encourage mystical experience or emphasize institutional authority? Should it include women's voices or maintain male leadership? The Gospel of Mary does not answer these questions directly, but it forces readers to confront them. The Gospel's survival through centuries of suppression testifies to its enduring power. Someone valued this text enough to preserve it despite obvious danger. Scribes copied it carefully. Monks hid it in remote monasteries. Collectors saved it from destruction. Their efforts ensure that Mary's voice continues to speak across the centuries. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Mary in the modern era has sparked new interest in alternative forms of Christianity. Scholars have gained insights into the diversity of early Christian thought. Feminists have found validation for women's spiritual authority. Mystics have discovered resources for contemplative practice. The ancient text speaks to contemporary concerns about authority, gender, and spiritual experience. The missing pages. The Gospel of Mary comes to us like a letter with pages torn away. The manuscript begins abruptly without introduction or context. We enter the story in the middle of a conversation, like walking into a room where important discussions are already underway. The opening line suggests that much has already been said, but we can only guess at the content of those lost words. Scholars estimate that at least 4 pages are missing from the beginning of the text. These pages might have contained crucial information about Mary's background and authority. Perhaps they described how she came to receive her special revelation from Jesus. Maybe they explain the circumstances that led to her teaching role among the apostles. The absence of this introductory material leaves modern readers without essential context. The missing beginning might have included a commissioning scene where Jesus specifically authorizes Mary to teach the other disciples. Many Gnostic texts begin with Jesus appearing to select followers and giving them special instructions. The Gospel of Mary might have followed this pattern. showing Jesus choosing Mary as a recipient of secret knowledge. Such a scene would have established her authority beyond question. Another possibility is that the lost pages contained additional teachings from Jesus that Mary preserved and transmitted. The surviving text focuses on the soul's journey through hostile powers, but Jesus might have shared other wisdom with Mary. These teachings could have covered topics like the nature of God, the purpose of creation, or the meaning of salvation. The loss of such material represents an irreplaceable gap in our understanding. The missing pages might also have described Mary's preparation for receiving revelation. Gnostic texts often emphasize the importance of spiritual readiness for receiving divine knowledge. Mary might have undergone specific practices or experiences that qualified her as a vessel for Jesus' teaching. The description of her spiritual development would have provided valuable insights into Gnostic ideas about mystical preparation. The middle section of the Gospel contains another significant gap. Several pages disappear right in the heart of Mary's vision account. She begins describing the soul's encounter with the first power, but then the text breaks off. When it resumes, the soul is already past several powers and approaching the final stages of its journey. This gap leaves us wondering about the content of the missing encounters. Each power that the soul meets represents a different obstacle to spiritual liberation. The first power might have represented basic material attachments like wealth or comfort. Subsequent powers could have embodied more subtle spiritual obstacles like pride or fear. The soul's responses to each challenge would have revealed important teachings about the nature of spiritual growth. The missing middle section might have contained the most dramatic moments of the soul's journey. Perhaps the soul faced its greatest temptations in the encounters we cannot read. Maybe the powers used their most sophisticated arguments to try to turn the soul back. The lost dialogue between soul and powers might have included the most profound spiritual teachings in the entire gospel. The abrupt ending of the manuscript creates another tantalizing mystery. Mary finishes describing the soul's successful ascent, but the text breaks off immediately afterward. We never learn how the other apostles responded to her complete teaching. We miss their questions and her answers. We lose the resolution of the tension between Mary and her critics. The missing ending might have shown Peter and Andrew accepting Mary's authority after hearing her full teaching. Perhaps her complete vision convinced them that Jesus had indeed shared special revelation with her. The lost conclusion could have depicted the apostles embracing Mary as their teacher and leader. Such an ending would have provided a positive resolution to the gender conflict in the text. Alternatively, the missing pages might have shown the conflict escalating rather than resolving. Peter and Andrew might have continued to reject Mary's teaching despite its obvious wisdom. The text could have ended with the apostles dividing into factions, some supporting Mary and others opposing her. This conclusion would have reflected the actual divisions that emerged in early Christianity. The lost ending might also have contained additional teachings or revelations. Mary could have shared other visions or mystical experiences. She might have provided practical guidance for the apostles' future ministry. The text could have included prophecies about the church's development or warnings about future challenges. These teachings would have been invaluable for understanding early Christian thought. Some scholars have attempted to reconstruct the missing sections based on parallels in other Gnostic texts. They note similarities between Mary's vision and accounts in other Gospels like the apocryphon of John. They suggest that the missing encounters might have followed patterns found in these related texts. However, such reconstructions remain highly speculative. The fragmentary nature of the Gospel of Mary actually enhances its mysterious power. The gaps force readers to use their imagination to fill in the missing pieces. The incomplete text becomes a puzzle that engages our curiosity and creativity. We become active participants in reconstructing the Gospel's meaning rather than passive recipients of its message. The missing pages also remind us of how much early Christian literature has been lost. The Gospel of Mary survived only by accident. Countless other texts disappeared completely. We can only imagine what treasures of early Christian thought have been permanently lost. The gaps in Mary's gospel represent the larger gaps in our knowledge of early Christianity. The survival of even these fragments seems miraculous. The manuscript endured centuries of persecution and neglect. It survived the destruction of Gnostic libraries. It escaped the fires that consumed heretical books. It weathered the decay that claimed so many ancient texts. Its preservation represents a victory over the forces that tried to silence Mary's voice. Modern technology offers new hope for recovering lost text. Advanced imaging techniques can sometimes reveal faded writing on damaged papyrus. Computer analysis can reconstruct missing words based on context and parallel texts. Digital restoration might eventually recover some of the Gospel of Mary's lost content, though complete reconstruction seems unlikely. The missing pages of the Gospel of Mary challenge us to consider what other voices have been silenced throughout history. How many women's teachings were lost when their texts were destroyed? How many alternative interpretations of Christianity disappeared with their manuscripts? How many spiritual insights vanished when diverse communities were suppressed? The gaps in Mary's gospel represent all the gaps in our understanding of the past. The soul's journey. Mary's vision unfolds like a sacred map of the soul's return to its divine source. She describes a journey that every human spirit must eventually undertake. The path leads upward through layers of spiritual opposition toward ultimate liberation. Each stage of the journey tests the soul's understanding and commitment. Each encounter reveals deeper truths about the nature of spiritual reality. The soul begins its ascent from the material world where most humans remain trapped. This realm appears solid and permanent to ordinary perception, but spiritual sight reveals its illusory nature. The soul recognizes that physical existence is temporary and limited. It understands that true life lies beyond material boundaries. This recognition marks the beginning of the journey toward God. The first power the soul encounters represents desire, the force that binds most humans to material existence. Desire creates attachments that prevent spiritual progress. It convinces the soul that happiness can be found in temporary pleasures. It generates endless cravings that can never be satisfied. The soul must overcome these attachments to continue its upward journey. The power of desire interrogates the ascending soul with seductive questions. It asks why the soul wants to leave the comfortable material world. It promises greater pleasures if the soul will abandon its spiritual quest. It suggests that the journey is too difficult and dangerous to complete. These temptations represent the internal resistance that every seeker faces. The soul responds to desire's challenge with wisdom rather than force. It explains that material pleasures are temporary and ultimately unsatisfying. It demonstrates understanding of its true spiritual nature. It refuses to be distracted by promises of worldly rewards. This response shows that the soul has gained genuine knowledge about the difference between appearance and reality. The second power represents ignorance, the force that keeps humans unaware of their divine nature. Ignorance creates confusion about the purpose of existence. It convinces people that they are merely physical beings without spiritual significance. It obscures the path to liberation through false teachings and distractions. The soul must pierce through this veil of confusion to continue its ascent. Ignorance questions the soul's right to seek divine knowledge. It suggests that such wisdom is reserved for special beings beyond human reach. It argues that the soul should be content with conventional understanding. It warns that seeking higher truth leads to arrogance and delusion. These arguments reflect the institutional resistance that mystics often encounter. The soul answers ignorance by demonstrating its divine origin and destiny. It explains that all souls contain sparks of divine light that naturally seek to return to their source. It shows that conventional understanding is limited and incomplete. It proves that direct spiritual experience provides more reliable knowledge than second-hand teaching. This response reveals the soul's growing confidence in its spiritual identity. The third power represents wrath, the force that uses anger and violence to maintain control. Wrath appears as a fearsome opponent that threatens to destroy anyone who challenges its authority. It rules through intimidation and punishment. It convinces people that submission is safer than resistance. The soul must face this apparent threat without being overcome by fear. Wrath confronts the soul with accusations and threats. It claims that the soul has no right to ascend to higher realms. It threatens punishment for the soul's presumption in seeking divine knowledge. It tries to provoke the soul to anger or violence in response. These tactics represent the persecution that spiritual seekers often face from worldly authorities. The soul responds to wrath with peaceful confidence. It refuses to be intimidated by threats or provoked to anger. It explains that divine love is stronger than any form of violence. It demonstrates that spiritual authority transcends worldly power. This peaceful response neutralizes wrath's effectiveness and allows the soul to continue its journey. The final power represents the deepest level of spiritual opposition. This force is more subtle than the others, using sophisticated arguments and apparent wisdom to turn souls away from their goal. It represents the ego's final attempt to maintain control over spiritual development. The soul's encounter with this power determines whether it will achieve complete liberation. This ultimate challenge tests everything the soul has learned during its journey. All previous insights must be integrated and applied. All spiritual resources must be mobilized. The soul must demonstrate complete commitment to its divine nature. This final test separates those who achieve genuine liberation from those who remain trapped in spiritual illusion. The soul's successful passage through all these challenges represents the completion of the spiritual journey. It has overcome every obstacle that prevents union with the divine. It has demonstrated mastery of spiritual principles. It has proven its readiness to return to its divine source. The journey ends with the soul's joyful reunion with God. Mary's description of this journey serves multiple purposes in the gospel. It provides a map for other souls who seek liberation. It demonstrates Mary's spiritual authority through her knowledge of these mysteries. It shows that salvation requires active participation rather than passive faith. It reveals the complex spiritual reality that lies behind physical appearances. The vision also reflects Gnostic understanding of the spiritual cosmos. The hostile powers represent the archons or rulers that Gnostics believed controlled the material world. These beings tried to prevent souls from returning to the divine realm. Only those with proper knowledge could navigate safely past these obstacles. Mary's vision provides the necessary information for successful spiritual travel. The soul's journey parallels the hero's journey found in mythology and literature. The soul begins in ordinary consciousness, receives a call to adventure, faces various trials, gains wisdom and power, and returns transformed. This universal pattern explains why Mary's vision has continued to resonate with readers across centuries and cultures. The emphasis on knowledge rather than faith distinguishes this vision from orthodox Christian teaching. The soul succeeds through understanding rather than belief. It overcomes obstacles through wisdom rather than grace. It achieves liberation through self-knowledge rather than external salvation. This approach appeals to those who value personal spiritual experience over institutional authority. Mary's vision offers hope to all who feel trapped by material circumstances. It suggests that liberation is possible for every soul willing to undertake the journey. It provides practical guidance for overcoming spiritual obstacles. It promises that temporary suffering leads to eternal joy. This message of hope explains the gospel's enduring appeal to spiritual seekers throughout history. Peter versus Mary. The moment arrives like thunder after lightning. Mary has finished sharing her mystical vision with the apostles. Her words hang in the air like incense, rich with spiritual meaning. The silence stretches as the disciples absorb what they have heard. Then Peter rises, his face dark with confusion and anger. The confrontation that follows will echo through centuries of Christian history. Peter's challenge comes swift and sharp. He questions whether Jesus would have spoken privately to a woman. His words carry the weight of centuries of tradition that placed men in positions of spiritual authority. Women might serve and support, but they did not teach or lead. The idea that Jesus would share secret knowledge with Mary while excluding the male apostles seems impossible to Peter. The apostles' reaction reveals deep insecurities about his own position. Peter had been with Jesus from the beginning. He had been chosen as the rock upon which the church would be built. He had received the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Yet here was Mary claiming to possess teachings that Peter had never heard. Her revelation threatened his status as the primary apostle. Peter's challenge also reflects broader cultural assumptions about women's capabilities. Ancient society generally viewed women as intellectually inferior to men. They were considered more emotional and less rational. They were thought to be easily deceived by false spirits or deluded by their own fantasies. Peter's skepticism about Mary's vision would have seemed reasonable to most people in his culture. Andrew joins Peter in questioning Mary's authority. The two leading apostles present a united front against her claims. Andrew wonders whether Jesus would really have given such important teachings to Mary rather than to them. His doubt reinforces Peter's challenge and shows that resistance to Mary's authority extends beyond one individual. The institutional church begins to form its opposition to women's leadership. The confrontation becomes personal when Peter suggests that Mary might be lying. He implies that she has fabricated her vision to gain importance among the apostles. This accusation attacks not only Mary's spiritual authority, but also her personal integrity. Peter essentially calls her a false prophet who misleads the faithful with invented revelations. Mary's response to these attacks reveals her spiritual maturity. She does not defend herself with anger or argument. She does not attack Peter's own failures or question his authority. Instead, she appeals to the apostles' sense of fairness and spiritual discernment. She asks whether they think she would invent such a vision or deceive them about her experience with Jesus. The restraint Mary shows in the face of Peter's accusations demonstrates her wisdom and self-control. A less mature person might have responded with equal hostility. Mary understands that anger would only confirm her critics' assumptions about women's emotional instability. By remaining calm and dignified, she maintains her authority while exposing the weakness of Peter's position. Levi emerges as Mary's defender in this crucial moment. He reminds Peter of his own volatile temperament and past failures. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times during the crucifixion. He had been rebuked by Jesus for trying to prevent the crucifixion. He had shown fear and confusion many times. Levi suggests that Peter should be more humble about questioning others' spiritual experiences. Levi's support for Mary reveals that the apostles were not unanimous in their attitude toward women's authority. Some recognized that Jesus had treated women as equals and valued their insights. They remembered that women had remained faithful during the crucifixion while the men fled. They acknowledged that Mary had been the first to see the risen Jesus. This minority position kept alive the possibility of women's leadership. The defender argues that Jesus chose Mary for special revelation because he recognized her spiritual readiness. Not all the apostles were equally prepared to receive certain teachings. Jesus had often spoken privately with individual disciples when they were ready for specific insights. Mary's vision represented Jesus' confidence in her ability to understand and transmit complex spiritual truths. Levi challenges the other apostles to focus on the content of Mary's teaching rather than her gender. The vision she shared contained profound wisdom about the soul's journey to God. It offered guidance for spiritual seekers and insight into the nature of salvation. These benefits should not be rejected simply because they came through a woman rather than a man. The confrontation ends without clear resolution. Peter and Andrew are not convinced by Levi's arguments. They remain skeptical about Mary's authority and suspicious of her claims. Mary does not press her case further. She has shared what she received and defended her integrity. The outcome must be left to the individual conscience of each apostle. This unresolved conflict reflects the actual divisions that emerged in early Christianity. Some communities accepted women's leadership and valued their spiritual contributions. Others restricted women to supportive roles and questioned their spiritual authority. The tension between these positions shaped the development of Christian doctrine and practice for centuries. The Gospel of Mary presents this confrontation as a crucial moment in church history. The apostles' response to Mary's teaching would determine whether women would be included in Christian leadership. Peter's rejection of her authority foreshadows the Orthodox Church's eventual exclusion of women from ordained ministry. Levi's support suggests alternative possibilities that were ultimately rejected. The conflict between Peter and Mary symbolizes broader tensions within early Christianity. Institutional authority competed with charismatic revelation. Male leadership challenged female wisdom. Hierarchical control opposed mystical experience. Orthodox doctrine confronted Gnostic insight. These tensions would be resolved through the victory of institutional, male, hierarchical, Orthodox Christianity. The Gospel of Mary preserves the memory of what might have been. It shows us a moment when different choices were possible. Women might have retained their leadership roles. Mystical experience might have been valued alongside institutional authority. Diverse voices might have contributed to Christian development. The text reminds us that history is shaped by human decisions, not divine inevitability. The confrontation between Peter and Mary continues to resonate in contemporary debates about women's roles in Christianity. Some denominations have embraced women's ordination and leadership. Others maintain traditional restrictions on women's authority. The Gospel of Mary provides historical perspective on these ongoing controversies by showing that the debate began in the earliest Christian communities. Modern readers can learn from both Mary's dignity and Levi's courage in this ancient confrontation. Mary shows how to maintain integrity while facing unjust criticism. Levi demonstrates the importance of standing up for marginalized voices. Together, they model how communities can work toward greater inclusion and justice despite opposition from established authorities. The Gnostic view of sin and salvation. The Gospel of Mary carries within its fragments a vision that would have shaken the foundations of early Christianity. Where Orthodox teachings spoke of humanity's fall from grace, Mary's Gospel whispers of something far more radical. Sin becomes not a stain upon the soul, but a simple case of forgetting who we truly are. Picture the scene in those early Christian communities. Bishops and teachers proclaimed that salvation came through Christ's sacrifice alone. The faithful must accept this truth through the Church's guidance. Yet here was Mary's voice, offering a different path entirely. She spoke of salvation as remembering, of sin as merely losing sight of our divine nature. The Gospel presents a cosmos where human beings carry within themselves the very essence of the divine. This spark of light, this fragment of the ultimate reality, never truly becomes corrupted. Instead, it simply forgets its origins. The soul wanders through ignorance, mistaking the material world for the only reality. This teaching flows like a gentle river through the manuscript's surviving pages. Mary describes how the soul in its journey toward the divine must recognize that suffering comes not from divine punishment, but from attachment to what is temporary. The powers that rule the lower realms feed on ignorance, keeping souls trapped in cycles of desire and fear. Consider how this understanding transforms the entire Christian message. Rather than requiring a savior to pay for humanity's sins, Mary's gospel suggests that each soul already possesses everything needed for salvation. The Christ becomes not a sacrifice, but a teacher, showing the way back to remembrance. The manuscript reveals teachings that would have threatened the very structure of the emerging church. If salvation comes through inner knowledge rather than institutional guidance, what need exists for priests and bishops? If the divine spark already dwells within each person, why submit to external authority? These ideas carried profound implications for how early Christians understood their relationship with the divine. The gospel suggests that each soul must undertake its own journey of awakening. No external savior can complete this work, though teachers and guides might illuminate the path. The text describes how the soul, in its ascent through the heavenly realms, encounters hostile powers that challenge its progress. These forces represent not external demons, but internal obstacles. Pride, anger, ignorance, and desire create barriers that the soul must recognize and transcend. Mary's vision presents salvation as a process of gradual awakening. The soul slowly remembers its true nature, shedding layers of illusion like a snake casting off old skin. Each recognition brings greater freedom. Each moment of remembrance dissolves another bond that holds the soul in captivity. The Gospel's approach to sin carries a gentle compassion rarely found in Orthodox teachings. Rather than condemning the soul for its failings, Mary describes how ignorance naturally leads to suffering. The soul acts out of darkness, not from malice, but from simply not knowing better. This understanding transforms judgment into compassion, punishment into teaching. The manuscript reveals how this knowledge was meant to be shared through direct experience rather than doctrinal instruction. The Gospel describes visions, mystical encounters, and inner revelations that guide the soul toward truth. These experiences cannot be reduced to simple beliefs or creeds, but must be lived and felt. The teaching suggests that each soul carries within itself the capacity for direct communion with the divine. This mystical awareness requires no intermediary, no institutional blessing, no external validation. The soul recognizes its own divine nature through inner experience alone. This radical vision of salvation explains why Mary's gospel would have been seen as dangerous by those establishing church authority. The text undermines the very foundations upon which ecclesiastical power rests. If each soul can achieve salvation through inner knowledge, the church's role becomes advisory rather than essential. The gospel presents a universe where the divine dwells not in distant heavens, but within the depths of human consciousness. This indwelling presence guides the soul toward freedom, offering wisdom and strength for the journey home. The material world becomes not a prison, but a school where souls learn to recognize their true nature. Through Mary's teachings, we glimpse a Christianity that might have been, a faith built on inner experience rather than outer authority, on remembrance rather than redemption, on the soul's inherent divinity rather than its fundamental corruption. The gospel whispers of a path where each seeker becomes their own priest, their own guide, their own doorway to the divine. Mary's leadership behind the fragmentary text of Mary's Gospel lies a story of leadership that history nearly erased. The manuscript offers glimpses of a woman who stood as teacher, visionary, and spiritual authority in the earliest Christian communities. Her voice carried weight not through institutional appointment, but through the profound wisdom she shared. The surviving passages reveal Mary comforting the apostles after Jesus' departure. They sit in grief and fear, uncertain how to continue their mission. Yet Mary rises to address their despair with words that calm their troubled hearts. This scene alone suggests her recognized role as a leader capable of guiding others through spiritual crisis. Consider the dynamics at play in those early gatherings. The apostles had walked with Jesus, heard his teachings firsthand, witnessed his ministry. Yet when confusion and doubt overwhelm them, they turn to Mary for guidance. Her words restore their courage and renew their sense of purpose. This depicts leadership earned through spiritual insight rather than formal authority. The gospel presents Mary as someone who received special revelations unavailable to others. She describes visions of the soul's journey through celestial realms, teachings about the nature of sin and salvation, insights into the deeper mysteries of existence. These visions position her as a conduit for divine wisdom, a role that naturally commands respect and attention. Her leadership style emerges through the manuscript's careful language. Rather than commanding obedience, Mary teaches through sharing her own spiritual experiences. She invites others to understand rather than demanding belief. Her authority flows from wisdom demonstrated rather than power claimed. The text reveals how Mary's leadership challenged conventional expectations. In a world where women rarely held teaching roles, she stands before the apostles as their equal, perhaps even their superior in spiritual understanding. Her confidence in sharing these revelations suggests she had long been recognized as a teacher within the community. The gospel shows Mary defending her authority against Peter's challenges. She responds to his doubts not with anger, but with patient explanation. Her defense demonstrates both strength and gentleness, characteristics that would have made her leadership particularly effective in diverse communities. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites suggests that women did indeed hold leadership positions in the earliest churches. House churches were often led by women who had the social standing and resources to host gatherings. Mary's depicted role aligns with this historical reality, showing her as someone who naturally assumed responsibility for the community's spiritual welfare. The manuscript presents Mary as a bridge between the earthly ministry of Jesus and the ongoing spiritual development of his followers. She interprets his teachings in ways that address the community's immediate needs while pointing toward deeper truths. This mediating role would have been crucial during the uncertain period following Jesus' departure. Her leadership appears to have been particularly focused on mystical and visionary experiences. The Gospel describes her receiving and sharing revelations that go beyond the simple moral teachings found in other early Christian texts. She guides others into deeper spiritual waters, helping them navigate the complexities of inner transformation. The text suggests that Mary's authority was recognized not just by the apostles, but by broader segments of the early Christian community. Her teachings were preserved, copied, and transmitted across generations, indicating a substantial following that valued her spiritual insights. This process of preservation itself demonstrates her lasting influence. The Gospel reveals Mary as a teacher who understood the individual nature of spiritual development. Rather than offering one-size-fits-all solutions, she appears to have guided people according to their unique needs and capacities. This personalized approach to spiritual leadership would have been particularly attractive to seekers who felt excluded by more rigid institutional structures. Her leadership model presents an alternative to the hierarchical systems that eventually dominated Christianity. Mary's authority emerges from wisdom and spiritual insight rather than institutional appointment. She leads through inspiration rather than command, through example rather than enforcement. The manuscript shows Mary as someone who could hold space for others' spiritual struggles. When the apostles despair, she doesn't dismiss their feelings, but helps them find meaning in their experience. This capacity for compassionate guidance marks her as a leader who understood the human heart as well as divine mysteries. The preservation of Mary's gospel itself testifies to her enduring leadership. Someone valued her teachings enough to record them, copy them, and hide them away for future generations. This act of preservation represents a form of resistance against forces that sought to diminish her influence. Through the fragmentary text, we glimpse a leader who embodied the very teachings she shared. Her calm presence in the midst of the apostles' turmoil, her patient response to Peter's challenges, her willingness to share profound spiritual insights, all these qualities suggest someone who had achieved the inner transformation she described. Mary's leadership style offers a template for spiritual authority based on wisdom rather than power, on service rather than domination, on the ability to guide others toward their own divine potential rather than demanding submission to external authority. Her example continues to inspire those who seek more authentic forms of spiritual leadership. The Gospel's hidden journey. The Gospel of Mary's survival through 16 centuries reads like an adventure story written in whispers and shadows. From its composition in the 2nd century to its rediscovery in 1896, the manuscript traveled paths that reveal both the dangers faced by forbidden texts and the dedication of those who preserved them. The Gospel likely began its journey in early Egypt, where early Christian communities embraced diverse teachings before Orthodox Christianity consolidated its power. Scribes working by lamplight copied the text onto papyrus, creating multiple versions that would be distributed among communities hungry for spiritual wisdom. Each copy represented both hope and risk for those who treasured these teachings. As the Roman Empire gradually embraced Christianity, church authorities began their campaign to define Orthodox belief. Texts that challenged official doctrine faced systematic destruction. The Gospel of Mary, with its radical teachings about women's spiritual authority and alternative paths to salvation, became a prime target for elimination. Communities that possessed such texts learned to hide them carefully. The manuscript probably survived its early centuries through the protection of Gnostic communities that recognized its value. These groups, scattered across Egypt and other regions, developed networks for sharing and preserving texts that mainstream Christianity condemned. They created underground libraries, hidden collections that kept forbidden wisdom alive. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, the pressure to conform intensified. Church councils worked to establish canonical scripture while condemning alternative texts as heretical. The Gospel of Mary faced active suppression, its very existence becoming dangerous for those who possessed it. Yet still it survived, passed quietly from hand to hand among those who valued its teachings. The manuscript's journey through the medieval period remains largely mysterious. Scholars believe it may have been preserved in monastery libraries, disguised among other texts, or hidden in secret collections. Some communities in remote regions maintained traditions that differed from official church doctrine, possibly providing safe haven for such manuscripts. The text likely traveled through various transformations during its hidden centuries. Scribes copied it onto different materials as papyrus degraded, possibly condensing or expanding sections based on their understanding and circumstances. Each copying created opportunities for both preservation and alteration, shaping the text that would eventually emerge into modern awareness. The Gospel's survival depended on individuals who risked persecution to maintain these teachings. Imagine the courage required to copy and preserve a text that church authorities condemned as dangerous heresy. Each scribe who worked on the manuscript became part of a chain of resistance that stretched across centuries. The manuscript probably spent periods buried in desert sands, hidden in clay jars alongside other forbidden texts. The dry climate of Egypt proved perfect for preserving ancient papyrus, creating accidental time capsules that would wait centuries for rediscovery. The Gospel of Mary became part of this hidden library, sleeping beneath the earth while the world above forgot its existence. Trade routes and scholarly networks may have carried copies across the Mediterranean world, creating multiple preservation sites. The text could have existed simultaneously in several locations, increasing its chances of survival. Each copy represented a different thread in the web of preservation that eventually delivered the gospel to modern readers. The manuscript's journey intersected with major historical events that shaped the preservation of ancient texts. The rise of Islam brought new perspectives on Christian diversity, sometimes providing more tolerant environments for variant teachings. The Crusades, medieval conflicts, and Renaissance humanism all influenced how ancient texts were treated and preserved. Scholars who studied early Christianity in later centuries occasionally encountered references to Mary's Gospel in other ancient texts. These mentions created tantalizing hints about a lost work that claimed to preserve Mary Magdalene's teachings. Such references kept alive the possibility that the text might someday be rediscovered. The manuscript's emergence in the late 19th century coincided with a period of intense archaeological discovery in Egypt. Scholars and collectors were actively seeking ancient texts, creating markets for papyrus manuscripts that had been hidden for centuries. The Gospel of Mary surfaced during this wave of rediscovery, finally finding its way into scholarly hands. The text's journey from marketplace to museum reveals another chapter in its hidden history. Dealers in ancient manuscripts recognized its potential value even if they couldn't fully understand its significance. The Gospel passed through various hands before reaching scholars who could appreciate its historical importance. Karl Reinhardt's purchase of the manuscript in Cairo represents the culmination of the Gospel's long journey through history. The text that had survived persecution, burial, and centuries of obscurity finally found its way to scholars who could bring it back to public attention. This moment marked not an ending, but a new beginning for Mary's teachings. The manuscript's survival testifies to the power of ideas that refuse to die. Despite systematic suppression, the Gospel of Mary endured through the dedication of unknown individuals who recognized its value. Their efforts ensured that Mary's voice would eventually be heard again, adding her perspective to our understanding of early Christianity. The Gospel's hidden journey reminds us that history contains many voices that official accounts silence or ignore. The manuscript's survival suggests that other forbidden texts may yet be discovered, waiting to expand our understanding of the diverse spiritual traditions that shaped early Christianity. Mary's Gospel blazed a trail that others might follow back to the light. Suppression of Gnostic texts. The systematic elimination of Gnostic texts represents one of history's most thorough campaigns to control religious thought. The Gospel of Mary fell victim to this process, along with dozens of other works that offered alternative visions of Christian faith. Understanding this suppression reveals how early Christianity narrowed from a diverse movement into a unified institution. The campaign began gradually in the 2nd century as church leaders recognized the need to establish consistent doctrine. Communities across the Roman Empire practiced Christianity in remarkably different ways, drawing on various texts and traditions. This diversity, while spiritually rich, created practical problems for leaders seeking to build a unified movement. Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon emerged as one of the most influential figures in this process. His work against heresies systematically attacked Gnostic teachings, labeling them as dangerous corruptions of true Christian faith. He argued that only texts approved by bishops who traced their authority back to the apostles could be considered authentic. This principle effectively eliminated many texts, including Mary's Gospel. The establishment of canonical scripture through various church councils created formal mechanisms for suppression. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE marked a turning point as Emperor Constantine supported efforts to create unified Christian doctrine. Texts that contradicted emerging Orthodox positions faced official condemnation and systematic destruction. Church authorities developed sophisticated arguments against Gnostic texts. They claimed these works were written too late to contain authentic apostolic teachings, despite evidence that many Gnostic texts were as early as canonical ones. They argued that Gnostic emphasis on secret knowledge contradicted Christianity's universal message, though the canonical Gospels themselves contain references to mysteries revealed only to disciples. The suppression took multiple forms across different regions. In some areas, authorities simply prohibited the copying or distribution of condemned texts. In others, they organized systematic searches and destruction campaigns. Communities caught possessing forbidden texts faced severe penalties, including excommunication and sometimes physical punishment. The growth of monastic communities provided both opportunities and challenges for text preservation. While some monasteries harbored diverse collections that included Gnostic works, others became centers for Orthodox scholarship that actively opposed alternative teachings. The fate of many texts depended on the theological orientation of the communities that housed them. Economic factors also played a role in suppression. Producing manuscripts required significant resources, and communities naturally prioritized texts that supported their theological positions. As Orthodox Christianity gained imperial support, funding flowed toward canonical texts while alternative works faced financial neglect. The suppression campaign succeeded partly because it offered practical advantages. Unified doctrine made it easier to train clergy, establish consistent practices, and present a coherent message to potential converts. The diversity that characterized early Christianity, while spiritually enriching, created administrative challenges that centralized authority helped solve. Language barriers contributed to the effectiveness of suppression. Many Gnostic texts were written in Greek or Coptic, languages that became less common as Latin Christianity spread through the Western Roman Empire. Texts that weren't translated into Latin faced natural obsolescence as Greek literacy declined in many regions. The campaign against Gnostic texts intensified during the 4th and 5th centuries as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Imperial power now supported Orthodox positions, making suppression more systematic and effective. Texts that had survived in small communities faced renewed pressure as church authority expanded. Some texts survived through deliberate concealment, as communities recognized the danger and took steps to preserve works they valued. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 revealed how effectively some groups managed to hide their treasured texts. These communities chose burial over destruction, hoping future generations might prove more receptive to diverse teachings. The suppression of Gnostic texts eliminated more than just alternative scriptures. It removed women's voices from early Christian tradition, as many Gnostic works featured female spiritual teachers and leaders. The Gospel of Mary represents just one example of how this process marginalized women's contributions to early Christianity. The campaign also suppressed mystical approaches to Christian faith. Gnostic texts emphasized direct spiritual experience, inner revelation, and personal transformation. Orthodox Christianity, while not rejecting these entirely, emphasized communal worship, institutional authority, and shared doctrine. The suppression of Gnostic texts tilted Christianity away from its more mystical potential. The effectiveness of suppression varied across regions and time periods. Areas with strong imperial presence saw more thorough elimination of alternative texts, while remote regions sometimes maintained diverse traditions longer. The survival of texts like Mary's Gospel depended partly on geography and partly on the determination of communities that valued them. The suppression of Gnostic texts reveals both the power and limitations of institutional authority. While church leaders successfully eliminated most alternative texts from circulation, they couldn't completely erase the ideas these works contained. References in other surviving texts, quotations by critics, and the occasional rediscovered manuscript keep these suppressed voices alive. The campaign against Gnostic texts established precedents that would influence Christianity for centuries. The emphasis on institutional authority over personal revelation, the prioritization of communal doctrine over individual spiritual experience, and the marginalization of women's religious leadership all trace back to this early period of suppression. Modern rediscovery of suppressed texts like the Gospel of Mary challenges us to reconsider what was lost in this process. These works reveal spiritual wisdom that might have enriched Christian tradition if it had been preserved rather than eliminated. Their survival reminds us that truth often endures despite efforts to suppress it. Mary Magdalene in medieval Christianity. The transformation of Mary Magdalene's image during the medieval period represents one of history's most dramatic rewriting of a religious figure. The woman who appears in the Gospel of Mary as a spiritual teacher and visionary became something entirely different in medieval Christian imagination. This metamorphosis reveals how religious institutions reshape memory to serve their purposes. The process began in the 6th century when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that would define Mary Magdalene for 1,000 years. He combined 3 different biblical women into a single figure, creating a composite character that bore little resemblance to the woman described in the Gospel of Mary. This papal decree transformed her from apostle to penitent, from teacher to student of forgiveness. Gregory's sermon merged Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and an unnamed sinful woman mentioned in Luke's Gospel. This combination created a powerful narrative arc that medieval audiences found compelling. The reformed prostitute became a symbol of redemption that resonated with Christian themes of sin and forgiveness, while simultaneously diminishing any claims to spiritual authority. The medieval Mary Magdalene emerged as the perfect penitent saint. Stories described her luxurious early life, her fall into sin, her encounter with Jesus, and her subsequent transformation into a model of repentance. These tales emphasized her emotional response to Jesus rather than any intellectual or spiritual insights she might have possessed. Her tears became more important than her words. This reimagining served multiple purposes for medieval Christianity. It provided a compelling model for repentance that could inspire others to seek forgiveness. It demonstrated the power of grace to transform even the most sinful lives. Most importantly, it removed any suggestion that Mary Magdalene had possessed special spiritual authority or unique teachings that differed from church doctrine. The medieval church developed elaborate legends about Mary Magdalene's life after the crucifixion. These stories often featured her as a hermit or contemplative, living in caves or remote locations where she devoted herself to prayer and penance. The caves of Saint-Baume in France became particularly associated with her legend, drawing pilgrims who sought to follow her example of withdrawal from the world. Artistic representations from this period consistently portrayed Mary Magdalene as a penitent figure. Painters depicted her with long hair that covered her body, emphasizing her modesty and humility. She often appeared with symbols of repentance like skulls, crosses, or books, reinforcing her role as a contemplative saint rather than an active teacher or leader. The medieval focus on Mary Magdalene's sexuality overshadowed every other aspect of her story. Whether portrayed as a reformed prostitute or simply as a woman who had lived luxuriously, her identity became defined by her relationship to sin and redemption. This emphasis on her sexual past effectively silenced any discussion of her spiritual insights or teaching authority. Monastic communities embraced Mary Magdalene as a patron saint, particularly those focused on caring for women who had lived as prostitutes. Her example inspired institutions that helped women transition from lives of sin to lives of religious devotion. While these efforts demonstrated genuine compassion, they also reinforced the limited role that medieval Christianity assigned to women in spiritual life. The medieval period saw the development of elaborate liturgical celebrations honoring Mary Magdalene. These ceremonies emphasized her role as a penitent and her devotion to Jesus, but they rarely mentioned her appearances in the canonical Gospels as a witness to the resurrection. The liturgy shaped how ordinary Christians understood her story, reinforcing the image of the repentant sinner rather than the faithful disciple. Popular devotion to Mary Magdalene flourished during the medieval period, but this devotion focused almost exclusively on her emotional relationship with Jesus, rather than any teachings she might have shared. Prayers addressed to her emphasized her role as an intercessor who could help other sinners find forgiveness. Her spiritual authority was channeled into acceptable feminine roles of intercession and emotional support. The medieval period also saw the rise of Mary Magdalene's cult in various European regions. Towns competed to claim relics associated with her, creating elaborate stories about how her remains or possessions had arrived in their communities. These claims brought pilgrims and economic benefits while reinforcing the sanitized version of her story that medieval Christianity promoted. Universities and scholars during the medieval period rarely questioned the composite image of Mary Magdalene established by Pope Gregory. The intellectual tradition of the time emphasized authority and tradition over critical examination of sources. The few scholars who encountered references to alternative traditions about Mary Magdalene lacked the historical tools to challenge established narratives. The medieval transformation of Mary Magdalene's image reveals how religious institutions can reshape memory to serve contemporary needs. The woman who appears in the Gospel of Mary as a confident teacher and visionary became a figure who validated rather than challenged existing power structures. Her authority was redirected into channels that supported rather than questioned institutional control. The medieval period also saw the development of mystical traditions that might have been more receptive to Mary Magdalene's authentic voice. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Mechthild of Magdeburg demonstrated that medieval Christianity could embrace women's spiritual insights. Yet even these remarkable women worked within institutional frameworks that limited their authority. The medieval treatment of Mary Magdalene established patterns that would influence Christian thought for centuries. Her example became a template for how women's spiritual experiences should be understood and expressed. The emphasis on emotion over intellect, on repentance over teaching, on withdrawal over engagement, shaped expectations for women's religious roles. This medieval transformation explains why the rediscovery of texts like the Gospel of Mary creates such controversy. The woman described in these ancient texts bears little resemblance to the figure that medieval Christianity created. Recovering her authentic voice requires not just archaeological discovery, but also the courage to question centuries of accumulated tradition. The medieval period's treatment of Mary Magdalene reminds us that religious traditions are not static, but constantly evolving. The same institutional forces that transformed her image in the 6th century continue to shape how religious figures are understood and presented. The Gospel of Mary offers a window into alternative possibilities that medieval Christianity chose to close. The rise of Mary's cult. The veneration of Mary Magdalene across medieval Europe created one of Christianity's most enduring and complex cults. Her transformed image as the penitent saint inspired countless devotions, pilgrimages, and religious institutions. This widespread devotion reveals how effectively the medieval church channeled popular religious enthusiasm while maintaining control over Mary's legacy. The cult of Mary Magdalene emerged during the early medieval period as Christianity sought to provide saints who could inspire and guide the faithful. Her story of transformation from sinner to saint offered a powerful model for redemption that resonated with people struggling with their own spiritual journeys. The dramatic arc of her alleged life provided rich material for religious imagination. France became the epicenter of Mary Magdalene's cult, with multiple regions claiming connections to her post-crucifixion life. The town of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume developed elaborate legends about her arrival in southern France, complete with stories of her preaching and eventual retreat to a cave for contemplation. These tales attracted pilgrims from across Europe who sought to follow in her footsteps. The Cave of St. Baume became particularly significant in Mary Magdalene's cult. Pilgrims climbed the rocky path to reach the grotto where she allegedly spent her final years in prayer and penance. The cave's natural drama, its darkness, its isolation, its connection to the earth, perfectly complemented the medieval understanding of Mary's spiritual journey. Visitors reported mystical experiences and miraculous healings. Venice emerged as another major center for Mary Magdalene's veneration when the city claimed to possess her relics. The translation of her remains from France to Venice in 1279 created a powerful religious spectacle that enhanced the city's spiritual prestige. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding these relics demonstrated how medieval Christianity used sacred objects to inspire devotion and attract pilgrims. The cult spread throughout Germany, where numerous churches and monasteries adopted Mary Magdalene as their patron saint. German devotion often emphasized her role as a contemplative mystic, connecting her story to the rich tradition of German mysticism that flourished during the medieval period. Religious communities found in her example inspiration for their own withdrawal from worldly concerns. England developed its own traditions surrounding Mary Magdalene, often connecting her to other legendary figures like Joseph of Arimathea. These stories wove her into the fabric of English religious legend, creating narratives that made her relevant to local spiritual traditions. English pilgrims traveled to continental shrines while also developing domestic sites associated with her memory. The cult of Mary Magdalene influenced the development of religious art throughout Europe. Painters, sculptors, and illuminators created countless depictions of her story, from her encounter with Jesus to her years of contemplation. These artistic representations shaped popular understanding of her character, emphasizing her emotional relationship with the divine rather than any intellectual or teaching authority. Religious orders dedicated to Mary Magdalene emerged across Europe, particularly those focused on caring for women who had lived as prostitutes. These communities saw in her example a model for their own work of redemption and rehabilitation. The Order of the Penitents of Saint Mary Magdalene, founded in the 13th century, established houses that provided refuge and spiritual guidance for women seeking new lives. The cult's growth coincided with the development of popular religious literature that made her story accessible to ordinary believers. The Golden Legend, compiled by Jacobus de Voragine in the 13th century, included an extensive account of Mary Magdalene's life that combined biblical material with medieval legends. This influential work shaped how generations of Christians understood her story. Liturgical developments enhanced the cult's influence by creating special ceremonies and prayers dedicated to Mary Magdalene. These services emphasized her role as a penitent and intercessor, providing structured ways for believers to connect with her example. The liturgy became a vehicle for transmitting the medieval understanding of her character to new generations of Christians. Economic factors also contributed to the cult's expansion. Towns that claimed connections to Mary Magdalene benefited from the pilgrim traffic that her shrines attracted. Local businesses developed around these religious sites, creating economic incentives for promoting and maintaining her cult. The intersection of spiritual devotion and economic opportunity ensured the cult's continued growth. The cult of Mary Magdalene reflected broader changes in medieval Christianity's approach to sanctity and devotion. The emphasis on emotional connection to religious figures, the importance of pilgrimage as a spiritual practice, and the development of elaborate legends about saints' lives all characterized the period's religious sensibility. Mary Magdalene's cult both shaped and was shaped by these broader trends. Women played crucial roles in developing and sustaining Mary Magdalene's cult. Female mystics, nuns, and laywomen found in her example a model for their own spiritual aspirations. While the medieval church limited women's formal authority, the cult provided channels for expressing feminine religious experience and leadership. Women's devotion to Mary Magdalene created spaces for spiritual authority that complemented rather than challenged institutional structures. The cult's influence extended beyond formal religious boundaries into popular culture and folk tradition. Stories about Mary Magdalene became part of the oral tradition that passed from generation to generation, creating a rich tapestry of legend and belief that surrounded her memory. These popular traditions often preserved elements that differed from official church teaching, maintaining alternative perspectives on her significance. The medieval cult of Mary Magdalene demonstrates how religious institutions can both preserve and transform spiritual traditions. While the cult maintained her memory and inspired countless believers, it also effectively silenced the voice that speaks through texts like the Gospel of Mary. The woman who appears in the early Christian text as a confident teacher became a figure who validated rather than challenged existing religious authority. The cult's endurance through the medieval period and beyond reveals the power of religious imagination to create meaning and inspire devotion. Even when based on historical foundations that scholars now question, the cult of Mary Magdalene provided spiritual sustenance for countless believers. Her example offered hope for redemption and transformation that spoke to fundamental human needs. This medieval development of Mary Magdalene's cult set the stage for all subsequent understanding of her significance. The elaborate traditions, artistic representations, and institutional structures that emerged during this period created a legacy that would influence Christian thought for centuries. Recovering her authentic voice requires understanding not just the ancient texts, but also the medieval transformation that obscured her original message. The Church's gender problem. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's authentic voice reflects a broader struggle within early Christianity over women's roles in religious life. The Gospel of Mary preserves evidence of women's spiritual leadership that the emerging church would systematically marginalize. This process reveals how institutional needs gradually overcame the more egalitarian impulses that characterized Christianity's earliest communities. The canonical Gospels themselves contain hints of the tension that would eventually lead to women's exclusion from formal religious authority. Mary Magdalene appears as the first witness to the resurrection, yet the male apostles initially dismiss her testimony. This pattern, women receiving divine revelation but facing skepticism from male leaders, would become a recurring theme in early Christian history. Paul's letters reveal the complexity of early Christian attitudes toward women's participation in religious life. While he acknowledges women who served as deacons, teachers, and even apostles, he also includes passages that restrict women's speaking in churches. These contradictory elements suggest that early Christian communities struggled with questions about gender and religious authority from the very beginning. The Gospel of Mary provides crucial evidence for understanding this struggle. The text shows Peter challenging Mary's authority specifically because she is a woman, asking whether Jesus would really have spoken privately to a woman rather than to the male apostles. This scene captures the essence of the debate that would shape Christianity's development for centuries. The early Christian movement attracted many women, partly because it offered them opportunities for spiritual leadership that secular society denied. Women hosted house churches, served as teachers and evangelists, and received respect for their spiritual insights. The Gospel of Mary suggests that some women, like Mary Magdalene, achieved recognition as spiritual authorities equal to the male apostles. However, as Christianity grew and sought respectability within Roman society, pressure mounted to conform to conventional gender expectations. Roman culture restricted women's public roles, and Christian communities that wanted to attract converts and avoid persecution found it advantageous to adopt similar restrictions. The radical equality of early Christianity gradually gave way to more conventional social arrangements. The development of church hierarchy accelerated the marginalization of women's leadership. As bishops and priests assumed greater authority, the informal leadership that women had exercised in house churches became less significant. The institutionalization of Christianity created structures that naturally favored male authority, since Roman society already associated public leadership with masculinity. Theological arguments emerged to justify women's exclusion from formal religious authority. Church fathers drew on selective biblical passages, philosophical traditions that viewed women as intellectually inferior, and cultural assumptions about women's proper roles. These arguments created a theological framework that made women's exclusion seem divinely ordained rather than culturally determined. The suppression of texts, like the Gospel of Mary, was part of this broader effort to marginalize women's voices in Christianity. By eliminating works that showed women as spiritual teachers and authorities, the church could more easily argue that such roles were inappropriate for women. The absence of evidence for women's leadership made it easier to claim that God had never intended women to serve in such capacities. The treatment of Mary Magdalene exemplifies this process of marginalization. The Gospel of Mary presents her as a confident teacher who comforts troubled disciples and shares profound spiritual insights. Medieval Christianity transformed her into a repentant prostitute whose main qualification was her emotional devotion to Jesus. This transformation removed any suggestion that she had possessed teaching authority or special spiritual knowledge. The Church's gender problem had lasting consequences for Christian spiritual development. By excluding women from formal leadership and suppressing texts that preserved women's voices, Christianity lost access to perspectives that might have enriched its theological tradition. The Gospel of Mary hints at mystical and visionary approaches to faith that were marginalized along with women's authority. The emergence of monasticism provided some opportunities for women's spiritual leadership, but within carefully controlled boundaries. Abbesses could exercise authority over their communities, and some achieved recognition as teachers and mystics. However, these opportunities were limited to women who accepted celibacy and remained within institutional structures that ultimately subordinated them to male authority. The medieval period saw occasional challenges to women's marginalization, particularly from mystical traditions that emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional authority. Women like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Catherine of Siena achieved recognition as spiritual teachers, but they succeeded partly by working within accepted feminine roles rather than challenging them directly. The Church's approach to women's sexuality played a crucial role in limiting their spiritual authority. By emphasizing women's potential for sexual temptation and their need for male guidance, Church teaching created theological justifications for women's subordination. The transformation of Mary Magdalene into a reformed prostitute exemplifies how women's sexuality was used to limit their spiritual authority. The suppression of women's voices in early Christianity also reflects broader questions about the nature of religious authority. The Gospel of Mary suggests that early Christian communities sometimes recognized authority based on spiritual insight rather than institutional position. As Christianity became more institutionalized, this charismatic authority gave way to bureaucratic structures that favored male leadership. The rediscovery of texts like the Gospel of Mary challenges modern Christianity to reconsider its assumptions about gender and spiritual authority. These ancient works preserve evidence of women's leadership that official church history obscured. They suggest that the marginalization of women was not inevitable, but resulted from specific historical choices that could have been made differently. The Church's gender problem reveals how religious institutions can be shaped by cultural assumptions as much as by theological principles. The gradual exclusion of women from Christian leadership demonstrates how social pressures can override religious ideals, creating traditions that later generations accept as divinely ordained. Understanding this historical process helps explain why the Gospel of Mary disappeared from Christian consciousness for so many centuries. The text preserved a vision of women's spiritual authority that became increasingly incompatible with church doctrine. Its suppression was not merely about eliminating a single text, but about erasing evidence of alternative possibilities for Christian community. The Church's treatment of gender reveals broader questions about how religious traditions develop and change. The early Christian movement's radical inclusivity gradually gave way to more conventional social arrangements as the Church sought acceptance and stability. This process shows how revolutionary spiritual insights can be domesticated by institutional needs. The recovery of Mary Magdalene's voice through texts like the Gospel of Mary offers opportunities to reconsider these historical developments. Her example suggests that women's spiritual authority was not an innovation but a recovery of Christianity's earliest traditions. The Church's gender problem may reflect not divine will, but historical circumstances that can be reconsidered and changed. The Gospel's modern rediscovery. The Gospel of Mary's emergence into modern awareness began with a dusty manuscript purchase in a Cairo antiquities market in 1896. Karl Reinhardt, a German scholar, acquired what would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. Yet, the manuscript's journey from market stall to scholarly recognition reveals how slowly revolutionary ideas penetrate academic consciousness. Reinhardt recognized the manuscript's potential importance but died before he could publish his findings. The Papyrus Codex sat in Berlin's Egyptian Museum for years, waiting for someone with the expertise and courage to reveal its contents. This delay demonstrates how even groundbreaking discoveries can languish without proper scholarly attention. The first translation appeared in 1955, nearly 60 years after the manuscript's acquisition. Walter Till, a German Coptologist, finally brought Mary's voice back to public attention through his careful work with the fragmentary text. His translation marked the beginning of serious scholarly engagement with the Gospel's challenging content. The manuscript's rediscovery coincided with broader changes in biblical scholarship that made scholars more receptive to alternative early Christian texts. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 had already demonstrated that ancient Jewish and Christian traditions were far more diverse than previously understood. This context helped scholars appreciate the Gospel of Mary's significance. The 1960s and 1970s saw increasing interest in the manuscript as feminist scholars began examining early Christian history through new lenses. These researchers recognized that the Gospel of Mary preserved evidence of women's leadership that official church history had obscured. The text became a crucial piece of evidence for understanding how Christianity had marginalized women's voices. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 provided additional context for understanding the Gospel of Mary. This collection of Gnostic texts revealed an entire tradition of early Christian thought that had been suppressed by Orthodox Christianity. The Gospel of Mary was no longer an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader alternative Christian tradition. Academic conferences and scholarly publications began featuring papers on the Gospel of Mary as researchers explored its theological implications. The manuscript challenged fundamental assumptions about early Christian development, particularly regarding women's roles and the diversity of early Christian thought. These discussions gradually expanded beyond academic circles. The translation of the Gospel into multiple languages made it accessible to broader audiences. English, French, German, and other translations allowed scholars and interested readers worldwide to engage with Mary's teachings. Each translation brought its own interpretive challenges as scholars struggled to convey the text's subtle theological language. The development of women's studies programs in universities created new academic spaces for examining the Gospel of Mary. These programs approached the text not just as a historical curiosity, but as evidence of suppressed women's voices that deserved serious scholarly attention. The manuscript became a touchstone for understanding how religious traditions can marginalize certain perspectives. The rise of liberation theology in the 1960s and 1970s provided another framework for understanding the Gospel of Mary's significance. Scholars working in this tradition recognized how the text preserved voices of those who had been marginalized by dominant religious institutions. The Gospel's emphasis on inner knowledge and personal spiritual authority resonated with liberation theology's concerns. Popular interest in the Gospel of Mary grew alongside academic attention. Books written for general audiences began featuring the text, often connecting it to broader questions about women's roles in religion and society. These popular treatments sometimes sensationalized the manuscript's contents, but also brought it to the attention of readers who might never encounter academic scholarship. The manuscript's rediscovery occurred during a period of intense questioning about religious authority and traditional institutions. The social movements of the 1960s had created skepticism about established institutions, making audiences more receptive to alternative perspectives on religious history. The Gospel of Mary offered evidence that Christianity's development had involved choices rather than inevitabilities. Archaeological discoveries continued to provide context for understanding the Gospel of Mary. Excavations of early Christian sites revealed evidence of women's leadership roles, supporting the manuscript's depiction of Mary Magdalene as a spiritual authority. These discoveries helped scholars appreciate that the gospel reflected historical realities rather than fictional scenarios. The development of new scholarly methods for studying ancient texts enhanced understanding of the Gospel of Mary. Literary criticism, social history, and comparative religion all contributed insights that enriched interpretation of the manuscript. These methodological advances allowed scholars to appreciate the text's complexity and sophistication. The manuscript's modern rediscovery also coincided with broader cultural shifts regarding gender and spiritual authority. The women's liberation movement created audiences eager to discover suppressed women's voices in religious history. The Gospel of Mary provided powerful evidence that women had once held spiritual authority in Christianity's earliest communities. Interfaith dialogue and comparative religious studies created new contexts for appreciating the Gospel of Mary. Scholars began comparing its teachings with those found in other mystical traditions, recognizing similarities with Hindu, Buddhist, and other spiritual paths. These comparisons highlighted the universal aspects of the manuscript's spiritual insights. The digitization of ancient texts made the Gospel of Mary more accessible to researchers worldwide. High-resolution photographs of the manuscript allowed scholars to examine the papyrus directly, leading to new insights about its composition and transmission. Digital humanities projects created databases that facilitated comparative study of early Christian texts. The manuscript's modern rediscovery demonstrates how historical accidents can shape religious understanding. If Karl Reinhard had not purchased the Codex in 1896, or if Walter Till had not translated it in 1955, Mary's voice might have remained silent indefinitely. The Gospel's emergence into modern consciousness depended on a series of scholarly choices and cultural developments. This rediscovery process continues today as new scholarly tools and perspectives reveal additional layers of meaning in the Gospel of Mary. Each generation of scholars brings fresh insights to the text, finding new relevance in its ancient wisdom. The manuscript's modern journey from obscurity to recognition demonstrates how suppressed voices can eventually find their way back into historical consciousness. The Da Vinci Code effect. The publication of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code in 2003 created a cultural phenomenon that thrust Mary Magdalene and early Christian history into popular consciousness like never before. The novel's blend of mystery, religious controversy, and historical speculation captured public imagination, generating intense interest in figures like Mary Magdalene and texts like her Gospel. This popularization brought both opportunities and challenges for serious scholarship. Brown's novel presented Mary Magdalene as Jesus' wife and the mother of his child, ideas that had circulated in fringe scholarship for decades but had never achieved mainstream attention. The book suggested that the Catholic Church had suppressed evidence of this relationship to maintain male authority and doctrinal control. These claims, while fictional, resonated with readers who suspected that religious institutions might indeed hide inconvenient truths. The novel's success sparked unprecedented public interest in early Christian history. Bookstores created special sections devoted to Mary Magdalene, early Christianity, and Gnostic texts. Publishers rushed to print new editions of ancient texts, scholarly works, and popular books, exploring the themes that Brown had dramatized. The Gospel of Mary suddenly found itself at the center of cultural conversations. Academic scholars found themselves in an unusual position, as media outlets sought expert commentary on the novel's claims. Many researchers welcomed the opportunity to discuss their work with broader audiences, even while correcting misconceptions that the novel had popularized. The scholarly community faced the challenge of engaging with popular culture while maintaining academic integrity. The novel's portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a suppressed feminine divine principle struck a chord with readers, particularly women who felt that traditional Christianity had marginalized feminine spiritual authority. The book's suggestion that early Christianity had been more egalitarian than its later institutional forms appealed to those seeking alternatives to conventional religious structures. Documentary films and television programs capitalized on the novel's success by exploring its historical claims. These productions often featured scholars discussing the Gospel of Mary and other early Christian texts, bringing academic research to television audiences. While these programs sometimes sensationalized their content, they also provided platforms for serious scholarly discussion. The novel's impact extended beyond entertainment into religious and academic discourse. Churches found themselves fielding questions from parishioners who wondered whether the book's claims might be true. Seminary courses began addressing the novel's themes, and religious education programs incorporated discussions of early Christian diversity and women's roles in religious history. The phenomenon revealed a deep cultural hunger for alternative perspectives on religious history. Readers responded enthusiastically to the suggestion that official religious accounts might be incomplete or deliberately misleading. This appetite for hidden histories reflected broader cultural skepticism about institutional authority and traditional narratives. The novel's success also highlighted the gap between academic scholarship and popular understanding of early Christianity. While scholars had been studying texts like the Gospel of Mary for decades, their work had remained largely confined to academic circles. The popular response to Brown's novel demonstrated that broader audiences were eager to engage with these materials. Critics of the novel argued that it confused fiction with history, presenting speculative theories as established facts. Scholars worried that the book's popularity might mislead readers about the actual state of historical evidence regarding Mary Magdalene and early Christianity. This concern sparked debates about the responsibility of popular writers when dealing with religious and historical topics. The novel's portrayal of the Catholic Church as a powerful institution that suppressed truth resonated with readers who had experienced disillusionment with religious authority. The book tapped into existing suspicions about institutional power and secrecy, using these themes to drive its narrative. This aspect of the novel's appeal revealed broader cultural tensions about religious authority. The commercial success of the Da Vinci Code inspired numerous imitators and spin-offs, creating a cottage industry of books, films, and other media exploring similar themes. This proliferation of Mary Magdalene-related content kept the character in public consciousness while often further blurring the line between historical scholarship and fictional speculation. The novel's impact on tourism was remarkable, as readers flocked to locations mentioned in the book. Sites associated with Mary Magdalene, including the Cave of St. Baume in France and various churches claiming to house her relics, experienced unprecedented visitor numbers. This tourism boom brought economic benefits while also raising questions about the commercialization of religious sites. The phenomenon demonstrated the power of narrative to shape public understanding of historical figures. Brown's fictional portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a powerful, suppressed figure proved more compelling to many readers than the traditional image of her as a repentant prostitute. This shift in perception influenced how subsequent authors and filmmakers approached the character. The scholarly response to the novel's success was mixed. Some researchers appreciated the increased attention to their field, while others worried about the proliferation of misinformation. The phenomenon highlighted the challenges that scholars face in communicating complex historical research to popular audiences. The novel's global reach brought international attention to early Christian studies and the Gospel of Mary. Translations of the book appeared in dozens of languages, spreading interest in Mary Magdalene and early Christian history to cultures worldwide. This international impact demonstrated the universal appeal of stories about suppressed truth and hidden knowledge. The Da Vinci Code effect continued long after the novel's initial publication, influencing how Mary Magdalene appears in subsequent popular culture. Films, novels, and television programs continue to draw on themes that Brown popularized, often presenting Mary Magdalene as a powerful figure whose true story has been suppressed by institutional Christianity. The phenomenon also sparked renewed interest in women's roles in religious history more broadly. Readers who discovered Mary Magdalene through Brown's novel often went on to explore other suppressed women's voices in religious traditions. This broader interest created opportunities for feminist scholars to share their research with wider audiences. The novel's success revealed both the potential and the dangers of popularizing scholarly research. While it brought valuable attention to important historical questions, it also demonstrated how popular culture can distort academic findings. The Da Vinci Code effect remains a cautionary tale about the responsibilities that come with translating scholarly research for popular consumption. The lasting impact of the novel can be seen in continued popular interest in Mary Magdalene and early Christian history. The Gospel of Mary and other ancient texts continue to find new audiences, partly because Brown's novel introduced these materials to readers who might never have encountered them otherwise. This democratization of historical knowledge represents one of the phenomenon's most significant contributions. Mary in Gnostic thought. Within the rich tapestry of Gnostic literature, Mary Magdalene emerges as a figure of profound spiritual significance, representing far more than the biographical details of a single historical person. The Gnostic texts present her as an archetype of the awakened soul, a symbol of the divine feminine principle, and a guide for those seeking liberation from the material world's illusions. The Gospel of Thomas, one of the most important Gnostic texts, concludes with a striking dialogue about Mary Magdalene that reveals the tension between earthly gender distinctions and spiritual transcendence. When Peter suggests that Mary should leave the disciples because women are not worthy of life, Jesus responds by promising to make her male, so that she too might become a living spirit. This puzzling statement reflects Gnostic beliefs about the ultimate unity that transcends all dualities, including gender. The Gospel of Philip presents Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, describing their relationship in terms that suggest both intimate partnership and spiritual symbolism. The text refers to her as the one whom Jesus loved more than all other disciples, creating a narrative that emphasizes her unique spiritual connection to the divine teacher. This portrayal positions her as a bridge between the human and divine realms. In the Pistis Sophia, an extensive Gnostic text, Mary Magdalene appears as the most frequent questioner of Jesus' teachings, demonstrating her role as a spiritual seeker who pursues deeper understanding. She asks more questions than any other disciple, showing her eagerness to comprehend the mysteries that Jesus reveals. This portrayal establishes her as a model for those who seek gnosis through persistent inquiry. The Gnostic texts consistently present Mary Magdalene as a recipient of special revelations unavailable to other disciples. These visions often concern the soul's journey after death, the nature of divine reality, and the path to spiritual liberation. Her role as a visionary positions her as a conduit for knowledge that transcends ordinary human understanding. The dialogue of the Savior features Mary Magdalene alongside other disciples in conversations about spiritual matters, but her contributions often demonstrate particular insight into the nature of suffering and transcendence. The text presents her transcendence. The text presents her as someone who has achieved a level of spiritual understanding that allows her to grasp subtle teachings that others struggle to comprehend. Gnostic thought viewed Mary Magdalene as an embodiment of Sophia, the divine wisdom that plays a crucial role in Gnostic cosmology. Sophia represents the feminine aspect of divinity that becomes involved in the material world's creation, experiencing both fall and redemption. Mary Magdalene's story parallels this cosmic drama, making her a symbol of the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The Gnostic emphasis on Mary Magdalene's spiritual authority reflected broader themes in this religious tradition. Gnosticism valued direct spiritual experience over institutional authority, personal revelation over communal doctrine, and inner transformation over external conformity. Mary Magdalene's portrayal as a visionary teacher embodied these values, making her an ideal figure for Gnostic spirituality. The texts present Mary Magdalene as a teacher in her own right, not merely a student or follower. The Gospel of Mary depicts her comforting the other disciples and sharing teachings that Jesus had given her privately. This teaching role positions her as a spiritual authority whose insights deserve respect and attention from other seekers. The Gnostic understanding of Mary Magdalene as a divine feminine principle connected her to broader cosmic themes. She represents the aspect of divinity that becomes involved in material creation while maintaining connection to transcendent reality. This role makes her both a symbol of divine descent into matter and divine ascent back to spiritual unity. The texts often present Mary Magdalene as a model for the perfected soul that has achieved gnosis. Her spiritual journey from ordinary human consciousness to enlightened awareness provides a template for others seeking similar transformation. The Gnostic authors used her example to illustrate the possibility of spiritual liberation available to all souls. The Gnostic portrayal of Mary Magdalene's relationship with Jesus transcends simple biographical details to explore the mystical union between the soul and divine reality. Their connection represents the intimate relationship that can develop between the seeker and the source of spiritual wisdom. This symbolic interpretation transforms their story into a teaching about spiritual development. The texts present Mary Magdalene as someone who has transcended the limitations that typically constrain human consciousness. She moves freely between earthly and heavenly realms, receives visions of cosmic realities, and understands teachings that confuse other disciples. This transcendence makes her a figure of hope for those seeking their own spiritual liberation. The Gnostic emphasis on Mary Magdalene's unique spiritual gifts reflects this tradition's appreciation for diverse forms of religious experience. Rather than insisting on uniform beliefs or practices, Gnosticism celebrated the variety of ways that individuals might encounter divine truth. Mary Magdalene's distinctive spiritual path exemplifies this diversity. The texts often present Mary Magdalene as a bridge between different levels of spiritual understanding. She can communicate with both ordinary disciples who struggle with confusion and doubt, and with Jesus, who represents perfect spiritual realization. This mediating role makes her particularly valuable for communities of spiritual seekers at various stages of development. The Gnostic understanding of Mary Magdalene as a cosmic figure connected her story to the broader drama of creation, fall, and redemption that characterizes this religious tradition. Her personal journey mirrors the soul's universal experience of separation from divine source and eventual return to spiritual unity. This cosmic significance transforms her from a historical figure into a mythological archetype. The texts present Mary Magdalene as a guardian of secret knowledge that could transform human consciousness. The revelations she receives and shares concern fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the purpose of existence, and the path to spiritual freedom. Her role as a keeper of these mysteries makes her a crucial figure for those seeking enlightenment. The Gnostic portrayal of Mary Magdalene emphasizes her courage in pursuing spiritual truth despite opposition and misunderstanding. The Gospel of Mary shows her defending her revelations against Peter's skepticism, demonstrating the strength required to maintain spiritual conviction in the face of institutional pressure. This courage makes her a model for those who must choose between conformity and spiritual integrity. The text suggests that Mary Magdalene's spiritual achievements were available to others who followed her example of dedicated seeking. Her enlightenment was not unique, but representative of the potential that exists within all souls. This democratic understanding of spiritual possibility makes her story particularly inspiring for those on their own spiritual journeys. The Gnostic tradition's emphasis on Mary Magdalene as a spiritual teacher and visionary preserved an alternative understanding of feminine religious authority that mainstream Christianity would later suppress. Her portrayal in these texts suggests that early Christian communities recognized diverse forms of spiritual leadership that transcended conventional gender roles. This recognition makes her a powerful symbol for those seeking to recover suppressed aspects of religious tradition. The surviving fragments of Mary's Gospel read like whispered secrets from another world. Each line carries wisdom that reaches beyond the boundaries of time. These aren't simply religious teachings. They form a complete philosophy of human existence, suffering, and transformation that challenges everything we thought we knew about early Christian thought. Mary speaks of suffering as an illusion created by the soul's own attachment to temporary things. This understanding flows through every word of her vision like a gentle stream carrying profound truths. When she describes the soul's journey through hostile powers, she reveals how we trap ourselves in cycles of pain and longing through our own ignorance of our divine nature. Her teaching begins with a simple yet revolutionary truth. Suffering comes from believing we are separate from the divine source of all existence. This separation creates fear, which generates desire, which produces attachment to things that cannot last. The chain of cause and effect becomes clear when we follow her reasoning. We suffer because we forget our true nature as eternal beings temporarily housed in physical forms. The gospel presents a radical view of sin that turns traditional Christian doctrine on its head. Rather than moral failing that requires divine forgiveness, sin becomes ignorance of our divine essence. This ignorance clouds our vision like morning mist over a mountain valley. When the mist clears with the rising sun of understanding, we see clearly what was always there, waiting to be discovered. Mary's teachings on transcendence offer a pathway beyond traditional concepts of salvation. She doesn't promise rescue from above by an external savior. Instead, she points to the transformative power that already dwells within each soul, waiting to be awakened. This power needs no external validation or approval from religious authorities. It simply requires recognition and awakening through direct spiritual experience. The hostile powers in her vision represent internal obstacles rather than external demons threatening the soul. Each power the soul encounters mirrors a different form of attachment or fear that keeps us bound to illusion. Anger appears as a burning force that demands recognition and response. Desire manifests as a seductive voice promising fulfillment through external acquisition. Ignorance presents itself as comfortable darkness that resists the light of understanding. These teachings transform the journey of faith from external worship to internal discovery. The soul becomes both seeker and sought, questioner and answer, pilgrim and destination. This understanding dissolves the need for intermediaries between the divine and human experience, making each person their own priest and teacher. Mary's words about the nature of reality challenge conventional religious thought at its foundation. She suggests that the material world itself is a kind of dream or temporary manifestation of deeper spiritual reality, not false, but temporary, not evil, but limited in its ability to provide lasting satisfaction. The soul's task becomes learning to navigate this dream world while remembering its true home in divine consciousness. Her approach to spiritual practice emphasizes direct experience over belief systems. Knowledge comes through vision and inner encounter, not through doctrine and external study. Understanding emerges from personal revelation rather than theological education. This creates a deeply personal and immediate form of spirituality that bypasses traditional religious hierarchies. The Gospel's treatment of gender transcends physical distinctions between male and female. Mary speaks as a soul to other souls, addressing the eternal aspects of human nature that exist beyond bodily identity. Her authority comes from wisdom rather than position, from spiritual insight rather than official appointment. Her teachings apply equally to all seekers, regardless of their earthly identity or social status. These philosophical insights explain why Mary's gospel posed such a threat to established religious structures. It offered a path that bypassed traditional authority figures and institutional control. It suggested that each person could access divine truth directly without need for priests, bishops, or official interpreters. This democracy of spirit challenged hierarchies built on exclusive access to sacred knowledge. The surviving text reveals Mary as a master teacher who understood the human condition with remarkable clarity and compassion. Her words offer comfort to those suffering while providing practical guidance for transformation. She speaks to both the heart and mind, offering emotional healing alongside intellectual understanding of spiritual principles. The depth of her psychological insight rivals modern therapeutic approaches. She understands how attachment creates suffering, how fear generates defensive reactions, how ignorance perpetuates cycles of pain. Her solution involves awakening to our true nature rather than trying to fix or improve our false identity. The gospel's emphasis on inner authority empowers individuals to trust their own spiritual experience. Mary's example shows that authentic spiritual teaching comes from direct encounter with divine truth, rather than from studying ancient texts or following religious traditions. This radical individualism threatened the collective authority of early church leadership. Her teachings about the soul's journey provide a map for spiritual development that remains relevant across cultures and centuries. The progression from ignorance to wisdom, from attachment to freedom, from fear to love, represents universal aspects of human growth and transformation. The practical implications of Mary's teachings extend into daily life. Her understanding of suffering suggests approaches to handling difficulties that don't involve escape or denial. Her vision of transcendence offers hope for transformation that doesn't require abandoning the world, but rather seeing it clearly. The theological sophistication of her teachings demonstrates the intellectual depth of early Gnostic Christianity. These weren't simple folk beliefs, but carefully developed philosophical systems that engaged with the deepest questions of human existence. Mary's Gospel represents this tradition at its most refined and accessible. The preservation of these teachings in fragmentary form adds poignancy to their power. Like broken pottery that still reveals the beauty of its original design, Mary's words continue to inspire despite the gaps in our understanding. The missing pieces invite us to fill them with our own experience and insight. The secret teachings of Jesus? The question haunts scholars and believers alike, casting shadows across centuries of Christian tradition. Did Mary preserve authentic sayings of Jesus that were lost to official Christianity? Her gospel contains words attributed to the Savior that appear nowhere in canonical texts. These teachings feel both familiar and startling, like meeting an old friend who has changed in unexpected ways that reveal aspects of their character you never noticed before. Mary's Jesus speaks about the nature of sin in ways that diverge dramatically from traditional Christian doctrine. He describes sin as a temporary condition created by the soul's ignorance, rather than a permanent stain requiring divine forgiveness. The soul creates sin through its own attachment to illusion and identification with temporary forms. This understanding suggests that salvation comes through awakening to truth rather than through forgiveness of moral failures. These secret teachings present Jesus as a wisdom teacher focused on inner transformation rather than external religious observance. He offers techniques for spiritual development rather than rules for moral behavior. His concern centers on helping souls remember their divine nature rather than securing their obedience to external commands or institutional authority. The teachings recorded by Mary emphasize the soul's journey through different levels of consciousness as it returns to its divine source. Jesus describes this journey as a homecoming rather than an escape from the world. Each level of consciousness presents unique challenges and opportunities for growth. The soul must learn to navigate these realms with wisdom and courage, recognizing each obstacle as a teacher. Parallels exist between Mary's record and other Gnostic texts that suggest a consistent body of secret teachings circulating in early Christian communities. The Gospel of Thomas contains similar sayings about seeking the kingdom of heaven within rather than in external locations. The Gospel of Philip discusses the soul's relationship to divine light and the process of spiritual marriage. These connections suggest a coherent alternative tradition of Jesus' teachings. Mary's version of Jesus' teachings focuses heavily on the nature of suffering and its resolution through understanding. He explains how attachment to temporary things creates ongoing pain and disappointment. The soul finds peace by recognizing its eternal nature and releasing identification with passing phenomena. This understanding frees it from the cycle of desire and disappointment that characterizes ordinary human experience. The secret teachings also address the nature of authority and spiritual leadership in ways that challenge traditional church hierarchy. Jesus emphasizes that true authority comes from wisdom rather than position or official appointment. Those who understand the soul's journey can guide others, regardless of their official status or gender. This principle directly challenges hierarchical religious structures based on inherited authority. These teachings present a Jesus who is more concerned with awakening disciples than with gathering worshipers. He wants followers to become like him in wisdom and spiritual realization, rather than simply obey his commands. This transforms the relationship between teacher and student from submission to collaboration in spiritual development and mutual discovery. The authenticity of these secret teachings remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. Some argue that Mary's Gospel preserves genuine sayings that were excluded from canonical texts due to their challenging implications. Others suggest that these teachings developed later as Gnostic communities reflected on Jesus' message and elaborated upon it. Historical evidence supports both possibilities in different ways. Early Christian communities were remarkably diverse in their beliefs and practices, far more so than later Orthodox Christianity would suggest. Multiple versions of Jesus' teachings likely circulated among different groups, each emphasizing aspects that resonated with their particular spiritual needs and cultural context. The theological implications prove significant regardless of their historical authenticity. If Mary's Gospel contains authentic teachings, it suggests that official Christianity may have excluded important aspects of Jesus' message that emphasized individual spiritual development over institutional authority. This possibility challenges traditional assumptions about scriptural authority and doctrinal development. The secret teachings also reveal Jesus as a more complex figure than canonical texts suggest. He appears as both mystical teacher and practical guide, concerned with both spiritual awakening and psychological healing. This fuller portrait enriches our understanding of his message and mission, showing him as someone who understood the human condition with remarkable depth. The emphasis on secret or hidden teachings reflects ancient educational practices where advanced instruction was reserved for prepared students. Jesus may have shared deeper insights with close disciples while offering simpler teachings to general audiences. This graduated approach to spiritual education appears in many wisdom traditions. The preservation of these teachings in Mary's Gospel demonstrates the value early Christian communities placed on alternative voices and perspectives. Even if these teachings developed later than Jesus' lifetime, they represent serious attempts to understand and apply his message to the challenges of spiritual life. The psychological sophistication of these secret teachings suggests familiarity with advanced spiritual practices and states of consciousness. The descriptions of the soul's journey through different levels of awareness parallel experiences reported by contemplatives and mystics across cultures and traditions. Whether authentic or not, these secret teachings continue to inspire spiritual seekers who find in them a Christianity that emphasizes inner development over external conformity. They offer a vision of Jesus as a spiritual teacher whose primary concern was helping people awaken to their divine nature. The question of their authenticity may be less important than their capacity to inspire and transform. Like all great spiritual teachings, they point beyond themselves to direct experience of the truths they attempt to describe. In this sense, their value lies not in their historical accuracy, but in their ability to awaken spiritual insight. Peter and the politics of authority. The confrontation between Peter and Mary represents far more than a personal disagreement between two disciples. It embodies the fundamental tension between two competing visions of early Christianity that would ultimately determine the shape of Christian tradition for centuries to come. One vision emphasizes institutional authority and doctrinal uniformity. The other prioritizes personal revelation and individual spiritual experience as the primary sources of religious truth. Peter's challenge to Mary reveals deep anxiety about the source and nature of religious authority within the emerging Christian movement. He questions whether a woman can receive divine revelation. But this gender-based objection masks a more fundamental concern about who controls access to sacred knowledge and spiritual truth. If anyone can receive revelation directly from the divine, traditional leadership structures based on apostolic succession become vulnerable to challenge. The politics of this confrontation extend far beyond issues of gender equality or women's roles in religious leadership. Peter represents the emerging institutional church with its emphasis on apostolic succession, doctrinal unity, and hierarchical authority. Mary embodies the charismatic tradition that values personal spiritual experience over official position and individual insight over collective doctrine. This tension shaped the development of early Christianity in profound and lasting ways. Communities that followed the institutional model eventually became the Orthodox Church that dominated Christian history. Groups that emphasized personal revelation and individual spiritual authority often became labeled as heretical or Gnostic, their voices suppressed or eliminated entirely. The struggle between these two approaches appears in multiple early Christian texts beyond Mary's Gospel. The Gospel of Thomas presents similar tensions between different disciples over the nature of spiritual authority. The Gospel of Philip describes conflicts over who has the right to interpret Jesus' teachings. These recurring themes suggest widespread debate about leadership and doctrine throughout early Christian communities. Peter's objection to Mary's vision reflects practical concerns about church governance and community stability. If revelation comes directly to individuals without institutional mediation, how can religious communities maintain unity and order? This question became central to the formation of Orthodox Christianity and its emphasis on unified doctrine and centralized authority. The institutional solution involved establishing clear hierarchies and limiting access to divine revelation through official channels. Ordained leaders would interpret scripture and doctrine for the community, ensuring consistency and preventing the chaos that might result from competing revelations. This approach provided stability and organizational effectiveness, but potentially restricted spiritual development and individual religious experience. Mary's response to Peter's challenge demonstrates remarkable composure and spiritual maturity. She doesn't attack his position directly or engage in personal conflict. Instead, she appeals to the truth of her experience and the value of her teachings for the community. This approach suggests a more collaborative model of spiritual authority based on wisdom rather than power. The exchange reveals different understandings of how truth is validated in religious communities. Peter appeals to traditional authority and established precedent. Mary relies on the authenticity of her spiritual experience and the transformative power of her teachings. These different approaches to religious truth continue to create tension in spiritual communities. Levi's support for Mary indicates that the early Christian community was genuinely divided on these fundamental issues. Some disciples recognized the value of Mary's teachings regardless of her gender or lack of official position. Others struggled with accepting female spiritual leadership or individual revelation that challenged established authority. The political implications of this conflict extended far beyond individual communities to influence the entire trajectory of Christian development. The question of women's roles in Christianity would shape church policies and practices for centuries. Mary's exclusion from official leadership became a precedent for limiting women's religious authority throughout Christian history. The resolution of this conflict through Mary's silence carries deep symbolic meaning for understanding how alternative voices were suppressed in early Christianity. Her withdrawal from public teaching may represent the broader elimination of diverse perspectives in favor of institutional unity. The Orthodox Church's victory came at the cost of spiritual diversity and individual religious freedom. The gender dynamics of this confrontation reflect broader cultural attitudes toward women's authority and public voice in ancient Mediterranean society. Peter's challenge to Mary occurs within a cultural context that generally limited women's public roles and questioned their capacity for spiritual leadership. Modern feminist theologians have reclaimed Mary's confrontation with Peter as a symbol of resistance to patriarchal religious authority. Her willingness to speak truth to power inspires contemporary movements for women's religious leadership and gender equality in spiritual communities. Her example demonstrates that authentic spiritual authority transcends gender boundaries. The psychological dimensions of this conflict reveal how religious communities handled challenges to established authority. Peter's reaction to Mary's vision reflects the anxiety that innovative spiritual insights create for traditional leadership. The fear of losing control or relevance drives resistance to new revelations or alternative perspectives. The politics of authority revealed in this confrontation continue to influence religious communities today. The tension between institutional control and personal revelation remains a source of ongoing debate and division in Christian churches and other spiritual traditions. Questions about who has the right to interpret sacred texts and spiritual experiences persist across denominational boundaries. Understanding this political dimension helps explain why Mary's gospel was excluded from canonical scripture. The decision wasn't based solely on theological disagreement or questions of authenticity. It represented a fundamental challenge to the emerging power structure of institutional Christianity and its claims to exclusive spiritual authority. The lasting impact of this confrontation extends beyond Christianity to influence broader cultural attitudes toward women's spiritual authority and religious leadership. The suppression of Mary's voice became part of a larger pattern of marginalizing women's contributions to religious and spiritual life. The Gospel's relevance today, Mary's ancient wisdom speaks with surprising directness to the spiritual hunger of our contemporary world. Her teachings about inner authority and personal revelation resonate powerfully with modern desires for authentic spiritual experience that transcends institutional religion. In an age of religious skepticism and institutional distrust, her voice offers a different path toward the sacred that feels both ancient and remarkably current. The Gospel's emphasis on direct divine encounter appeals strongly to people who feel disconnected from traditional religious practices and formal worship. Mary suggests that the sacred can be accessed without elaborate rituals, institutional intermediaries, or complex theological systems. This democratic approach to spirituality matches contemporary values of personal autonomy and individual spiritual discovery that characterize modern religious seeking. Her teachings about the nature of suffering provide practical guidance for addressing contemporary psychological challenges that plague modern life. The idea that suffering comes from attachment and ignorance offers tools for dealing with anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness that traditional therapy sometimes struggles to address. These insights complement therapeutic approaches while adding a spiritual dimension that many people find missing from purely psychological treatment. The Gospel's treatment of gender and spiritual authority speaks powerfully to ongoing struggles for equality and justice in religious institutions. Mary's example of female spiritual leadership challenges patriarchal religious structures that continue to limit women's roles in many faith traditions. Her wisdom demonstrates that spiritual insight and teaching ability transcend gender boundaries, providing scriptural support for women's ordination and religious leadership. Environmental concerns find unexpected support in Mary's teachings about the soul's relationship to the material world. Her vision of transcending attachment to temporary things suggests a more sustainable approach to consumption and resource use that addresses ecological crisis at its spiritual roots. This perspective offers spiritual grounding for environmental activism and sustainable living practices. The Gospel's emphasis on inner transformation, rather than external conformity, appeals to people seeking personal growth and self-actualization outside traditional religious frameworks. Mary's teachings provide a spiritual framework for psychological development that complements therapeutic and self-help approaches to healing and growth. Her focus on awakening to divine nature offers hope for transformation that goes beyond symptom management. Modern meditation and mindfulness practices share remarkable common ground with Mary's vision of the soul's journey through different levels of consciousness. Her descriptions of moving through spiritual realms parallel contemporary understanding of contemplative states and altered consciousness. This connection bridges ancient wisdom and modern spiritual practice in ways that enrich both traditions. The Gospel's challenge to religious authority resonates with contemporary criticism of institutional corruption and abuse of power in religious organizations. Mary's example of speaking truth to established authority inspires movements for reform and accountability within religious institutions. Her willingness to challenge Peter's objections demonstrates the courage needed to confront institutional resistance to change. Her teachings about the nature of reality align surprisingly well with quantum physics and consciousness research that challenge materialistic assumptions about the nature of existence. The idea that the material world is a kind of dream or temporary manifestation finds echoes in scientific theories about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. This convergence of ancient wisdom and modern science creates new possibilities for understanding the nature of existence. The Gospel's preservation of alternative voices in Christianity supports contemporary movements for theological diversity and inclusion within religious communities. Mary's example demonstrates that suppressed traditions can be recovered and renewed, offering hope for marginalized voices within religious institutions. This process of rediscovery enriches contemporary spiritual life by expanding the range of available wisdom and practice. Feminist theology has embraced Mary's gospel as crucial evidence of women's leadership and spiritual authority in early Christianity. Her teachings provide scriptural support for women's ordination and religious leadership that counters traditional arguments against gender equality. This recovery of female spiritual voices strengthens contemporary arguments for women's full participation in religious life. The Gospel's approach to spiritual practice emphasizes results over beliefs, appealing to people who value pragmatic spirituality that can be tested and verified through personal experience. Mary's teachings offer methods for spiritual development that focus on transformation rather than theological correctness. This empirical approach to spirituality appeals to scientifically minded seekers. Her vision of the soul's journey provides a framework for understanding life's challenges and opportunities that transforms suffering into opportunity for growth and learning. The idea that difficulties are teaching experiences rather than random punishments offers hope and meaning in times of struggle. This perspective helps people find purpose in adversity and strength in vulnerability. The Gospel's treatment of individual spiritual authority empowers people to trust their own religious experience rather than relying exclusively on external authorities. Mary's example shows that authentic spiritual insight can arise from personal revelation rather than institutional training. This empowerment of individual spiritual experience appeals to people seeking authentic rather than inherited faith. Contemporary interest in ancient wisdom traditions finds in Mary's Gospel a sophisticated spiritual psychology that addresses perennial human concerns about meaning, purpose, and transcendence. Her teachings offer practical guidance for spiritual development that remains relevant across cultural and historical boundaries. The Gospel's emphasis on inner healing and transformation speaks to contemporary interests in holistic approaches to health and wellness that address spiritual as well as physical and psychological dimensions of human experience. Mary's vision of the soul's journey toward wholeness offers a spiritual framework for understanding healing and growth. The enduring relevance of Mary's Gospel lies in its focus on universal human experiences that transcend specific cultural or historical contexts. Her teachings address fundamental aspects of existence that remain constant across time and culture, making her voice as relevant today as it was in ancient times. The Lost Pages, Theories, and Reconstructions. The missing sections of Mary's Gospel create tantalizing gaps in our understanding that have haunted scholars and spiritual seekers for more than a century. Experts estimate that nearly half of the original text has been lost to the ravages of time, leaving us with fragmentary glimpses of what may have been a complete theological treatise. These absent pages promise secrets that may never be fully recovered, creating a mystery that continues to inspire new theories and speculative reconstructions. The beginning of the Gospel likely contained Jesus' initial teachings to his disciples about the nature of spiritual reality and the soul's relationship to the divine. Based on patterns found in other Gnostic texts and the theological themes present in the surviving portions, scholars suggest this opening section probably described the soul's divine nature and its journey toward enlightenment. The missing opening may have presented Jesus as a wisdom teacher rather than a sacrifice for sin, establishing the philosophical framework for everything that follows. Reconstruction efforts focus on identifying common themes and terminology in related texts from the same period and theological tradition. The Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Philip share similar theological perspectives and vocabulary with Mary's Gospel, providing valuable clues about the likely content of the missing sections. These parallels suggest that the lost opening may have emphasized the kingdom of heaven as an inner reality rather than a future destination, consistent with Gnostic emphasis on immediate spiritual experience. The missing middle section likely contained more extensive details about Mary's visionary experience and the soul's ascent through different levels of consciousness. The surviving text describes 4 hostile powers that challenge the soul's journey, but the fragmentary nature of these passages suggests that much more detailed descriptions may have been lost. The missing pages may have revealed additional powers or provided more extensive dialogue between the soul and these challenging forces. Scholars speculate that the absent middle section included Jesus' direct teachings to Mary about the nature of spiritual authority and the validation of personal revelation. This content would have provided stronger scriptural support for her leadership role among the disciples and her authority as a teacher. The deliberate absence of this material may reflect early efforts to suppress female religious authority by removing supporting evidence. The lost ending of the gospel remains perhaps the most mysterious and significant gap in our understanding. Early Christian texts often concluded with commissioning scenes where Jesus sends his followers to spread his teachings throughout the world. Mary's gospel may have ended with a similar commission, explicitly establishing her authority as a teacher and missionary. Such an ending would have provided powerful support for women's religious leadership. Some researchers suggest that the missing conclusion contained Mary's detailed response to Peter's challenge and her defense of visionary experience as a valid source of religious authority. The surviving text ends abruptly after the confrontation, leaving readers without resolution to this crucial conflict. The lost ending may have shown Mary successfully defending her vision or alternatively withdrawing from public teaching to avoid further conflict. Modern computational techniques have been applied to analyze patterns in the surviving text and suggest possible reconstructions of missing sections. These computer-assisted approaches can identify recurring vocabulary, grammatical structures, and thematic patterns that might indicate the likely content of absent passages. However, such reconstructions remain highly speculative and cannot claim historical authenticity or scholarly consensus. The discovery of additional manuscript fragments occasionally provides new pieces of the puzzle, though these finds are rare and often disappointingly small. The Berlin Gnostic Codex and various manuscripts from the Nag Hammadi library have provided multiple copies of Mary's Gospel, each preserving slightly different readings and occasionally containing text missing from other versions. These variations sometimes allow scholars to reconstruct damaged passages. The theological implications of the lost pages extend far beyond academic curiosity to fundamental questions about the nature of early Christianity. The missing content may have contained teachings that would significantly alter our understanding of Jesus' message, the role of women in early Christian communities, and the diversity of belief and practice in the primitive church. These lost insights could reshape contemporary religious thought and practice. The emotional and spiritual impact of the missing pages creates a profound sense of loss and longing among readers who encounter the fragmentary text. The Gospel's broken condition mirrors the human experience of incomplete knowledge and partial understanding that characterizes our relationship to ultimate truth. This brokenness becomes part of the text's spiritual message about the nature of seeking and finding. Some contemporary spiritual communities have developed meditative practices and contemplative exercises around the missing sections, using the gaps as spaces for personal reflection and revelation. Rather than seeking to fill these absences with scholarly speculation, these approaches embrace the mystery and silence as opportunities for individual spiritual insight. The missing pages become invitations for readers to contribute their own understanding. The lost pages also represent broader patterns of historical loss and recovery that characterize our relationship to the past. Many ancient texts survive only in fragments, requiring scholars to piece together incomplete pictures of past civilizations and their wisdom traditions. Mary's Gospel exemplifies both the fragility of human knowledge and its remarkable resilience across time. Archaeological discoveries continue to offer hope that additional fragments of Mary's Gospel might someday be recovered. Each new find brings the possibility that more of her teachings might be rescued from oblivion. This ongoing search reflects humanity's persistent desire to recover lost wisdom and restore forgotten voices to their rightful place in our understanding of the past. The reconstruction efforts surrounding Mary's Gospel demonstrate both the possibilities and limitations of historical scholarship. While we can make educated guesses about the missing content based on comparative analysis and thematic consistency, the gaps ultimately resist definitive filling. This scholarly humility reminds us that the past often guards its secrets jealously. The missing pages serve as a powerful metaphor for the incomplete nature of all human knowledge and understanding. We see through a glass darkly, grasping fragments of truth while longing for complete comprehension. The broken text becomes a mirror of our own spiritual condition, incomplete yet meaningful, fragmented yet profound. Mary Magdalene, beyond Christianity. Mary's influence extends far beyond the boundaries of Christian tradition, reaching into the deepest currents of Western culture and human imagination. Her story has captured the hearts and minds of artists, writers, and spiritual seekers across cultures and centuries, transforming her from a biblical figure into a universal symbol of wisdom, love, and transcendence that speaks to fundamental human experiences. Renaissance artists portrayed Mary with a complexity and depth that went far beyond simple biblical narratives or traditional religious iconography. Master painters like Caravaggio and Titian depicted her as a figure of profound spiritual intensity and emotional depth, showing her as both human and divine, earthly and transcendent. These artistic interpretations helped establish her iconic status in Western visual culture, creating images that continue to influence how we imagine her presence and power. The artistic tradition surrounding Mary reveals changing cultural attitudes toward femininity, spirituality, and religious authority. Medieval artists often portrayed her as a penitent sinner, reflecting the Church's official narrative about her identity. Renaissance and Baroque artists began to emphasize her spiritual authority and mystical experience, suggesting a more complex understanding of her role in Christian history. Literary traditions have embraced Mary as a character of mystery and transformative power across numerous genres and historical periods. Medieval legends transformed her into a hermit saint living in the French countryside, performing miracles and teaching wisdom to pilgrims. Modern novels have reimagined her as Jesus' wife, spiritual partner, and equal in wisdom and authority. These fictional portrayals reflect changing cultural attitudes toward women, spirituality, and religious authority. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries found in Mary a powerful symbol of passionate love and spiritual longing that transcended conventional religious boundaries. Poets and writers used her story to explore themes of devotion, loss, and transcendence that resonated with Romantic sensibilities. Her image became associated with the ideal of the inspired woman who bridges earthly and divine realms through the power of love and vision. French culture has particularly embraced Mary through the persistent legend of her arrival in southern France following Jesus' crucifixion. The town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer continues to celebrate her memory with annual festivals and pilgrimages that attract thousands of visitors. This tradition has created a parallel narrative that exists alongside official Christian teaching, demonstrating the power of popular religion to preserve alternative stories. The legend of Mary's life in France includes dramatic elements that rival any adventure story. She is said to have arrived by boat without sails or oars, guided by divine providence to safety on the French coast. Her years of contemplation in a cave near Marseille became the stuff of legend, inspiring countless artistic works and spiritual practices. These stories, whether historically accurate or not, have shaped French cultural identity and spiritual imagination. Modern feminist movements have powerfully reclaimed Mary as a symbol of female empowerment and spiritual authority that challenges patriarchal religious structures. She represents women's capacity for religious leadership, mystical experience, and spiritual teaching that transcends traditional gender roles. This recovery of her story provides inspiration for contemporary struggles for equality and justice in religious institutions. The feminist reclamation of Mary extends beyond Christianity to broader cultural movements for women's rights and recognition. Her example of speaking truth to power resonates with contemporary women who face resistance to their authority and wisdom. Her courage in maintaining her vision despite opposition inspires those who struggle against institutional barriers to their full participation in public life. New Age spirituality has adopted Mary as a figure of divine feminine wisdom, who represents the return of goddess consciousness to Western spiritual life. She appears in channeled messages, meditation practices, and healing modalities that emphasize her role as a spiritual teacher and guide. This contemporary appropriation reflects broader cultural interests in alternative spirituality and the recovery of feminine wisdom traditions. The New Age presentation of Mary often emphasizes her role as a sacred feminine archetype who balances masculine religious authority with feminine spiritual wisdom. She becomes a representative of the divine feminine principle that complements and completes masculine spiritual energy. This interpretation draws on ancient goddess traditions while maintaining connection to Christian symbolism. Psychologically, Mary has become a powerful archetype representing the anima or divine feminine aspect of the human psyche. Jungian analysts interpret her story as representing the soul's journey toward wholeness and integration of masculine and feminine principles. This psychological reading makes her relevant to therapeutic contexts and personal growth work that goes beyond traditional religious boundaries. The psychological interpretation of Mary's story emphasizes her role as a guide for inner transformation and spiritual development. Her journey from follower to teacher, from silence to voice, from hiding to revelation, mirrors the psychological process of individuation and self-actualization. This understanding makes her story relevant to anyone seeking personal growth and spiritual development. Musical traditions have celebrated Mary through compositions ranging from medieval chants to contemporary popular songs. Her story provides rich material for exploring themes of love, loss, faith, and redemption that resonate across musical genres. These musical interpretations keep her memory alive in popular culture and introduce her story to new audiences. The musical tradition surrounding Mary includes both classical and popular expressions that demonstrate her broad cultural appeal. Sacred music has long celebrated her as a model of devotion and spiritual insight. Contemporary artists continue to find inspiration in her story, creating songs that explore themes of love, spirituality, and female empowerment. Academic fields beyond religious studies have embraced Mary as a subject of investigation and interpretation. Gender studies, art history, cultural anthropology, and literary criticism have all contributed to understanding her significance across different cultural contexts. This interdisciplinary approach reveals the complexity of her cultural impact and the multiple ways her story continues to generate meaning. The internet age has created new communities and networks centered around Mary's teachings and example. Online forums, social media groups, and digital publications explore her relevance to contemporary spiritual seekers and social justice activists. These virtual communities transcend geographical and denominational boundaries, creating global conversations about her significance. Digital technology has also enabled new forms of artistic and spiritual expression related to Mary's story. Virtual reality experiences, digital art installations, and online meditation practices create new ways of engaging with her teachings and example. These technological innovations demonstrate how ancient wisdom can find new expression in contemporary media. Modern pilgrimage practices have developed around sites associated with Mary's legend and historical presence. Travelers visit locations in France, Italy, and the Middle East, seeking connection with her spiritual energy and wisdom. These journeys reflect ongoing human needs for sacred encounter and transformation that transcend tourist experience. The pilgrimage tradition surrounding Mary includes both traditional religious practices and contemporary spiritual seeking. Some pilgrims follow established routes and practices developed over centuries. Others create their own spiritual journeys inspired by her example and teachings. This diversity reflects the broad appeal of her story across different spiritual traditions and personal beliefs. Contemporary art continues to find rich inspiration in Mary's story and symbolic presence. Installations, sculptures, and performance pieces explore themes of voice, authority, and suppression that remain relevant to current social and political issues. These artistic works bring her ancient story into dialogue with contemporary concerns and challenges. The ongoing artistic engagement with Mary's story demonstrates its continued relevance to human experience and social concern. Artists find in her example themes that speak to contemporary struggles for justice, equality, and spiritual authenticity. Her story provides a framework for exploring these issues through creative expression. The Gospel's literary style and symbolism. The Gospel of Mary speaks in a language different from the familiar rhythms of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Where the canonical Gospels tell stories with beginning, middle, and end, Mary's text flows like poetry. Her words dance between earth and heaven. They weave together dialogue and vision. They create patterns that mirror the soul's journey they describe. The text opens without introduction or genealogy. There are no birth narratives or historical settings. The Gospel begins in medias res, dropping readers into an ongoing conversation. This technique creates immediacy. We feel as though we have stumbled into a sacred gathering. The urgency of the moment draws us forward. The canonical Gospels follow biographical patterns. They trace Jesus' life from birth through death and resurrection. They place events in geographical and temporal contexts. They provide historical anchors that help readers understand the progression of Jesus' ministry. These narrative structures reflect the evangelist's desire to present Jesus as a historical figure. Mary's Gospel abandons such conventional storytelling. Time becomes fluid. Space transcends physical boundaries. The text moves seamlessly between earthly dialogue and mystical vision. Past and present merge in the eternal moment of revelation. This approach reflects Gnostic understanding that spiritual truth exists beyond temporal limitations. The language of Mary's Gospel employs symbolic rather than literal description. When Jesus speaks about vision, he describes inner sight rather than physical perception. When Mary recounts the soul's journey, she uses metaphorical language to convey spiritual realities. The powers that challenge the ascending soul represent psychological and spiritual obstacles rather than literal beings. Canonical Gospels use parables to teach spiritual truths through earthly images. Jesus speaks of seeds and soil, shepherds and sheep, fathers and children. These familiar metaphors help listeners understand abstract concepts through concrete examples. The teaching method assumes that spiritual truth can be communicated through material analogies. The Gospel of Mary reverses this approach. Earth becomes a metaphor for spiritual realities rather than the other way around. The soul's ascent represents the pattern of all spiritual growth. The hostile powers symbolize the resistance that all seekers encounter. The journey upward reflects the movement from ignorance to knowledge that defines Gnostic salvation. The dialogue structure in Mary's Gospel creates multiple layers of meaning. Mary converses with Jesus in her vision. She then shares this conversation with the apostles. The apostles debate among themselves about her revelation. Each level of dialogue reveals different aspects of the text's meaning. Readers experience the teaching through several perspectives simultaneously. The canonical Gospels often separate teaching from conflict. Jesus delivers the Sermon on the Mount without interruption. He tells parables to willing listeners. Opposition comes mainly from religious authorities rather than from his own disciples. This separation creates clear distinctions between wisdom and resistance, light and darkness. Mary's Gospel integrates teaching and conflict more thoroughly. The vision itself describes opposition through the hostile powers. The sharing of the vision immediately provokes disagreement among the apostles. Teaching and resistance exist in dynamic tension throughout the text. This structure reflects the reality that spiritual growth often involves internal and external conflict. The repetitive patterns in Mary's Gospel create a hypnotic quality. The soul encounters power after power in similar fashion. Each challenge follows a predictable sequence of question and response. This repetition serves multiple purposes. It creates a meditative rhythm that aids spiritual reflection. It reinforces key teachings through varied repetition. It mirrors the cyclical nature of spiritual development. The symbolic geography of Mary's vision follows vertical rather than horizontal movement. The soul ascends through levels of spiritual reality. Each stage represents higher understanding and greater freedom. This upward journey reflects ancient cosmological models that place the divine realm above the material world. The movement from below to above becomes a metaphor for spiritual transformation. The Gospel of Mary employs dramatic irony throughout its narrative. Readers know that Mary has received authentic revelation from Jesus. We understand that her vision contains genuine wisdom, yet we watch the apostles debate whether she should be believed. This gap between reader knowledge and character understanding creates tension that drives the narrative forward. The fragmented nature of the surviving text adds another layer of symbolism. The missing pages mirror the incomplete understanding that characterizes human spiritual knowledge. We glimpse fragments of truth but never possess the complete picture. This literary device reflects Gnostic teaching that spiritual understanding develops gradually through partial revelations. The gender dynamics in Mary's Gospel create symbolic tension that extends beyond literal interpretation. Mary represents the receptive principle that receives divine wisdom. Peter embodies the active principle that questions and challenges. Their conflict symbolizes the tension between intuitive and rational approaches to spiritual truth. The text suggests that both principles have value but must be properly balanced. The Gospel of Mary concludes without traditional resolution. The apostles' debate remains unfinished. Mary's fate after sharing her vision stays unknown. This open ending invites readers to continue the conversation. We must decide for ourselves whether to accept Mary's authority. The text becomes a mirror that reflects our own attitudes toward women's spiritual leadership. The poetic structure of Mary's Gospel creates an aesthetic experience that differs markedly from canonical texts. The rhythm of the language induces a contemplative state. The symbolic imagery engages the imagination. The mystical content appeals to intuitive understanding. These literary qualities support the text's spiritual message by creating an appropriate reading experience. The Gospel of Mary stands as a masterpiece of early Christian literature. Its sophisticated use of symbolism rivals the best mystical poetry. Its innovative narrative structure anticipates modern experimental fiction. Its integration of form and content demonstrates artistic maturity. The text deserves recognition not only for its historical importance, but also for its literary excellence. Beyond its aesthetic merits, the Gospel's literary style serves its theological purposes. The poetic language creates beauty that attracts readers to its message. The symbolic structure communicates truths that literal description cannot convey. The dialogue format models the kind of spiritual conversation that leads to enlightenment. Form and content work together to create a unified spiritual experience. Revisiting the discovery, if the afternoon sun slants through the dusty window of a Cairo antiquities shop, Dr. Karl Reinhardt examines manuscripts with the careful attention of a treasure hunter. The year is 1896. European scholars scour Egypt for ancient texts. Papyrus fragments command high prices among collectors. Every purchase might contain revolutionary discoveries. The leather-bound codex seems unremarkable at first glance. Its brown covers show signs of age and careful handling. The pages crackle when touched. Coptic text fills the yellowed papyrus in neat columns. Reinhardt recognizes the script but cannot read the language. He purchases the codex more from hope than certainty about its contents. The manuscript begins a journey that will span more than a century. From the Cairo shop, it travels to Berlin. Reinhardt stores it with other acquisitions in his private collection. The text waits patiently while scholars debate its significance. Years pass before anyone recognizes the treasure hidden in those ancient pages. Carl Schmidt receives the call that will define his scholarly career. Reinhardt has contacted him about a Coptic manuscript that might contain important early Christian texts. Schmidt specializes in such documents. He has spent decades learning to read the complex script and ancient language. His expertise makes him the ideal person to unlock the Codex's secrets. Schmidt's first examination of the manuscript sends excitement coursing through his scholarly soul. The Codex contains multiple texts, including Gospels and Acts attributed to various apostles. Among them, he discovers a gospel bearing the name of Mary Magdalene. No such text has ever been found intact. Early church fathers mentioned it only to condemn it as heretical. The translation process becomes Schmidt's obsession. Each Coptic word requires careful consideration. Ancient scribes sometimes abbreviated terms or used symbols that have multiple meanings. The papyrus is fragile. Handling it too roughly might destroy irreplaceable text. Schmidt works with the intensity of an archaeologist uncovering a pharaoh's tomb. The missing pages create immediate frustration. The text begins abruptly without introduction. Large sections vanish from the middle. The ending breaks off unexpectedly. Schmidt realizes he possesses only fragments of what was once a complete gospel. The gaps tantalize him with glimpses of lost wisdom. Schmidt publishes his preliminary findings in scholarly journals. The academic world responds with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Some scholars question the manuscript's authenticity, others debate its theological significance. A few dismiss it as a late Gnostic fabrication with little historical value. The debates continue for decades. World War I interrupts Schmidt's work on the manuscript. Academic conferences cease. Scholarly journals suspend publication. International cooperation becomes impossible. The Gospel of Mary waits in Berlin while the world tears itself apart. Schmidt fears that the manuscript might be lost in the chaos of war. The manuscript survives the war but faces new challenges. Post-war Germany struggles with economic collapse and political upheaval. Funding for scholarly research becomes scarce. Schmidt ages and his eyesight weakens. He worries that he will not live to complete his translation and commentary on the Gospel of Mary. Other scholars join the effort to bring Mary's Gospel to light. Walter Till takes up Schmidt's work and prepares new editions of the text. Henri Charles Puech provides French translations that make the Gospel accessible to a broader audience. Gradually, the text emerges from scholarly obscurity into public awareness. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 provides new context for understanding Mary's Gospel. Egyptian peasants uncover a jar containing 13 codices filled with Gnostic texts. These manuscripts include other Gospels that mention Mary Magdalene in prominent roles. Suddenly, the Gospel of Mary no longer stands alone as evidence for early Christian diversity. Scholars begin to piece together a more complete picture of early Christianity. The Gospel of Mary fits into a larger pattern of texts that valued women's spiritual authority. These documents preserve traditions that Orthodox Christianity suppressed. They reveal the diversity that characterized the early church before institutional uniformity was imposed. The translation and publication of Mary's Gospel accelerates during the second half of the 20th century. New scholarly editions appear in multiple languages. Popular translations make the text available to general readers. The Gospel begins to attract attention beyond academic circles. Feminist scholars embrace the Gospel of Mary as evidence for women's leadership in early Christianity. They use it to challenge traditional assumptions about gender roles in the church. The text becomes a rallying point for those who advocate women's ordination and equal participation in religious life. Popular culture discovers Mary's Gospel through novels and documentaries. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code introduces millions of readers to the idea that Mary Magdalene played a more important role than traditional Christianity acknowledged. The Gospel becomes part of a larger cultural conversation about hidden histories and suppressed truths. The digital age brings new opportunities for studying Mary's Gospel. High-resolution photographs allow scholars worldwide to examine the manuscript. Computer analysis reveals faded text that was previously invisible. Online databases make research resources available to anyone with internet access. The Gospel enters the 21st century with unprecedented accessibility. Modern conservation techniques help preserve the fragile papyrus for future generations. Climate-controlled storage protects the manuscript from further deterioration. Digital archives create permanent copies that will survive even if the original papyrus crumbles. These efforts ensure that Mary's voice will continue to speak across the centuries. The journey from Cairo shop to worldwide recognition spans more than a century. Dr. Reinhardt's casual purchase in 1896 launched a scholarly adventure that continues today. Each generation of researchers has added to our understanding of the text. Each translation has revealed new layers of meaning. The scholars who fought to bring Mary's Gospel to light deserve recognition as heroes of historical recovery. They worked against indifference, skepticism, and limited resources. They preserved a voice that powerful institutions had tried to silence. They ensured that Mary Magdalene could speak again after nearly 2 millennia of enforced silence. The Gospel of Mary's rediscovery reminds us that truth has a way of surviving even determined efforts at suppression. Ancient scribes preserved the text despite obvious danger. Modern scholars rescued it from obscurity despite academic prejudice. Popular interest has sustained it despite religious opposition. Mary's voice proves stronger than all attempts to silence it. Today, the Gospel of Mary rests in climate-controlled archives, but its influence spreads throughout the world. The ancient papyrus may be fragile, but the ideas it contains have gained new life. Mary Magdalene speaks to contemporary concerns about authority, gender, and spiritual authenticity. Her rediscovered voice challenges us to imagine new possibilities for faith and community. The Gospel's enduring mystery. More than a century has passed since Dr. Reinhardt purchased that leather-bound codex in Cairo. Scholars have translated every surviving word. Theologians have debated every possible interpretation. Popular writers have spun countless theories about its meaning. Yet the Gospel of Mary continues to guard its secrets like a sphinx watching over the desert. The missing pages haunt every reader of the text. We can only imagine what the beginning contained. Perhaps an introduction that established Mary's authority beyond question. Maybe a commissioning scene where Jesus specifically chose her as a teacher. The lost words might have included teachings that would revolutionize our understanding of early Christianity. The fragmentary nature of the manuscript mirrors the incomplete knowledge that characterizes all historical research. We possess scattered pieces of the ancient world. Documents survive by accident rather than design. The voices that speak to us across the centuries represent only a tiny fraction of those who lived and died in ages past. Mary's Gospel reminds us how much we have lost. Each generation discovers new questions in the ancient text. Early scholars focused on its authenticity and historical value. Feminists emphasized its portrayal of women's spiritual authority. Mystics found resources for contemplative practice. Popular culture embraced its challenge to traditional religious assumptions. The Gospel serves as a mirror that reflects the concerns of each age. The text's theological implications remain as controversial today as they were in the early church. Mary's vision suggests that salvation comes through knowledge rather than faith. It implies that individuals can have direct access to divine truth without institutional mediation. It challenges the exclusive authority that many religions claim for their leaders and scriptures. The gender dynamics in Mary's Gospel continue to provoke debate in contemporary religious communities. Some denominations have embraced women's ordination and leadership. Others maintain traditional restrictions on women's roles. The ancient conflict between Peter and Mary plays out in modern churches, synagogues, and mosques around the world. The Gospel of Mary raises fundamental questions about religious authority. Who has the right to interpret sacred truth? What qualifies someone to teach spiritual wisdom? How should communities respond to claims of private revelation? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in the first century. The text's emphasis on mystical experience appeals to those who seek direct spiritual encounter. In an age of religious skepticism and institutional decline, many people hunger for authentic spiritual experience. Mary's vision offers a model for personal revelation that bypasses traditional religious structures. It suggests that divine truth can be accessed through inner contemplation. The Gospel's portrayal of Jesus as a teacher of secret wisdom resonates with contemporary spiritual seekers. Many people are drawn to esoteric traditions that promise hidden knowledge. They are attracted to the idea that Jesus shared deeper teachings with select disciples. The Gospel of Mary feeds this hunger for spiritual secrets and exclusive insights. The text's survival through centuries of suppression inspires those who feel marginalized by mainstream religion. Mary's voice speaks for all who have been silenced by religious authorities. Her teaching offers hope to those who have been excluded from positions of spiritual leadership. The Gospel becomes a symbol of resistance against oppressive religious structures. Modern technology offers new ways to study the ancient manuscript. Advanced imaging techniques reveal faded text that was previously invisible. Computer analysis helps scholars understand the document's composition and transmission. Digital archives make the Gospel accessible to researchers worldwide. Yet these tools also deepen the mystery by revealing how much remains unknown. The Gospel of Mary continues to generate scholarly debate about early Christian diversity. Some historians argue that it preserves authentic traditions about Mary Magdalene. Others contend that it reflects later Gnostic speculation with little historical value. The evidence remains ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations. The text challenges assumptions about the development of Christian doctrine. It suggests that the orthodox version of Christianity emerged through conflict and compromise rather than divine guidance. It reveals that alternative interpretations of Jesus' message were suppressed rather than proven false. These insights force us to reconsider the foundations of religious authority. The Gospel's literary sophistication surprises many readers who expect ancient texts to be primitive or crude. The symbolic structure and poetic language demonstrate remarkable artistic achievement. The psychological insights into spiritual development rival modern mystical literature. The text demands recognition as a masterpiece of early Christian writing. The ongoing fascination with Mary's Gospel reflects broader cultural trends. People increasingly question traditional authorities and seek alternative sources of wisdom. They are drawn to suppressed histories and marginalized voices. They hunger for spiritual experiences that transcend institutional boundaries. The Gospel of Mary speaks to all these contemporary concerns. The text's fragmentary nature paradoxically enhances its appeal. The missing pages invite readers to use their imagination to fill the gaps. The incomplete narrative becomes a puzzle that engages our creativity. We become active participants in reconstructing the Gospel's meaning rather than passive recipients of its message. The Gospel of Mary endures because it addresses timeless human concerns. The search for spiritual truth, the struggle against oppressive authority, the desire for authentic religious experience, the quest for gender equality, these themes resonate across cultures and centuries. Mary's ancient voice speaks to contemporary hearts. The mystery deepens rather than diminishes with each new discovery about early Christianity. The more we learn about the diversity of the early church, the more questions arise about the Gospel of Mary's place in that spectrum. Each new Gnostic text provides context, but also creates new puzzles. Understanding grows, but so does awareness of what remains unknown. Perhaps the Gospel's greatest mystery lies in its continued relevance. Why does a fragmentary 2nd century text speak so powerfully to 21st century readers? What gives Mary's voice such enduring authority? How does her ancient vision continue to illuminate contemporary spiritual struggles? These questions have no simple answers, but they ensure that the Gospel of Mary will continue to fascinate future generations. The text stands as a testament to the power of suppressed voices to eventually find expression. Truth may be buried, but it cannot be destroyed. Wisdom may be silenced, but it cannot be permanently muted. The Gospel of Mary proves that authentic spiritual insight will eventually break through all barriers erected against it. Reflective outro. The ancient papyrus rests now in climate-controlled archives, its brown fibers carefully preserved for future generations. Yet Mary Magdalene's voice travels far beyond those protective walls. Her words echo in scholarly conferences and church debates. They resonate in novels and documentaries. They inspire artists and activists. They challenge believers and seekers alike. The journey that began in a Cairo antiquities shop in 1896 continues today. Dr. Reinhardt could never have imagined that his casual purchase would spark a revolution in understanding early Christianity. The leather-bound codex he bought for a few pounds sterling contained dynamite that would explode conventional assumptions about women's roles in the early church. Carl Schmitt's patient translation work in the early 20th century planted seeds that are still bearing fruit. Each word he decoded from the ancient Coptic script opened new possibilities for understanding Christian origins. His scholarly dedication rescued Mary's voice from the silence that had surrounded it for nearly 2 millennia. The Gospel of Mary forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about truth and memory. How many other voices were silenced along with Mary's? How many women's teachings were lost when their texts were destroyed? How many alternative visions of Christianity disappeared when Orthodox authorities consolidated their power? The answers remain hidden in the sands of time. The text reminds us that history is written by the victors. The Christianity we know today represents the triumph of one particular interpretation of Jesus' message. Other versions of the faith existed in the early centuries. They offered different perspectives on salvation, authority, and community. Most were eventually suppressed, leaving only fragmentary traces of their existence. Mary Magdalene emerges from this historical process as a symbol of all marginalized voices. Her transformation from apostle to penitent reflects the broader erasure of women's authority in religious traditions. Her rediscovery through the Gospel of Mary offers hope that silenced voices can eventually find expression. Truth may be buried, but it cannot be permanently destroyed. The Gospel challenges contemporary readers to examine their own assumptions about religious authority. Who gets to interpret sacred truth? What qualifies someone to teach spiritual wisdom? How should communities respond to diverse voices and perspectives? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in the early church. The text's emphasis on personal revelation speaks to an age increasingly skeptical of institutional authority. Many people hunger for direct spiritual experience rather than secondhand teaching. They seek authentic encounters with the divine that transcend organizational boundaries. Mary's vision offers a model for such personal spiritual discovery. The ongoing debate about the Gospel of Mary's significance reflects broader cultural tensions. Traditional religious communities often view it as a threat to established doctrine and practice. Progressive movements embrace it as validation for women's equality and spiritual authority. Academic scholars debate its historical value and theological implications. These varied responses ensure that the text will continue to generate discussion. The Gospel's literary sophistication demonstrates that early Christianity produced artistic as well as theological achievements. The symbolic structure and poetic language rival the best mystical literature of any era. The psychological insights into spiritual development remain relevant to contemporary seekers. The text deserves recognition as a masterpiece of spiritual writing. The fragmentary nature of the surviving manuscript serves as a metaphor for all human knowledge. We possess only pieces of the past. Our understanding remains incomplete. New discoveries can revolutionize our perspectives overnight. The gaps in Mary's Gospel remind us to remain humble about our certainties and open to new revelations. The Gospel of Mary stands as testament to the resilience of suppressed truth. Despite centuries of persecution and neglect, the text survived. Hidden in Egyptian caves and monastic libraries, it waited patiently for rediscovery. Its preservation seems almost miraculous, suggesting that some truths are destined to be revealed regardless of human opposition. The text's contemporary relevance demonstrates the timeless nature of spiritual insight. Mary's teachings about the soul's journey to God speak across cultural and temporal boundaries. Her vision of spiritual liberation transcends the specific circumstances of its composition. Ancient wisdom proves eternally applicable to human spiritual needs. The Gospel of Mary invites us to imagine different possibilities for religious faith and practice. What if the early church had embraced rather than rejected women's spiritual authority? What if mystical experience had been valued alongside institutional order? What if diverse voices had contributed to the development of Christian doctrine? These questions challenge us to consider alternative futures for religious communities. The rediscovery of Mary's Gospel parallels broader movements to recover marginalized histories. Scholars increasingly recognize the importance of suppressed voices in understanding the past. Activists work to restore forgotten figures to their rightful place in historical narratives. The Gospel of Mary participates in this larger project of historical recovery and justice. The text's enduring mystery ensures its continued relevance. Each generation will discover new meanings in its ancient words. Each culture will find fresh insights in its timeless wisdom. Each reader will encounter different challenges in its provocative questions. The Gospel of Mary will continue to evolve as it touches new hearts and minds. Was Mary Magdalene silenced by the forces that shaped early Christianity? The evidence suggests that her voice was systematically marginalized and eventually erased from official church history. The woman who stood at the cross and discovered the empty tomb was transformed into a penitent sinner. The apostle to the apostles became a reformed prostitute. Yet perhaps the more important question is whether Mary speaks louder now than ever before. Her rediscovered voice challenges religious institutions to reconsider women's roles. Her teachings inspire spiritual seekers to pursue personal revelation. Her example encourages marginalized people to claim their own authority. Her gospel proves that truth cannot be permanently suppressed. The ancient papyrus may crumble to dust, but Mary Magdalene's voice grows stronger with each passing year. She speaks through scholars who study her gospel. She inspires artists who depict her story. She encourages activists who work for justice. She comforts seekers who hunger for authentic spiritual experience. In the end, the Gospel of Mary reminds us that every voice matters. Every perspective contributes something valuable to human understanding. Every story deserves to be heard. Mary Magdalene's long silence has ended. Her voice now joins the eternal conversation about truth, meaning, and the sacred. She speaks not just for herself, but for all who have been forgotten, marginalized, or silenced. Her rediscovered voice proves that no truth can be buried forever, and no authentic spiritual insight can be permanently erased from human memory.